They ruled empires, waged wars, and shaped centuries. But behind the velvet curtains, the British royals were weird. Not just eccentric. Weird. A king who talked to trees. A queen who dressed for her own funeral, daily. A prince who slept in one boot to dodge death. These aren't myths. They're habits. Real, recorded, and royally baffling. So buckle up. Because once you peer behind the crown jewels, you'll find something stranger than fiction. 33 of the weirdest, most unsettling royal quirks ever whispered through palace halls. Before we dive in, if you love strange history, unsettling mysteries, and stories that make you question everything, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next descent into the bizarre. Also, while you're here, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments, because nothing makes royal weirdness better than knowing you're up at 3 a.m. watching a king talk to a tree. 1. King James I, England, Scotland. It's hard to trust a man who refused to eat an apple but devoured conspiracy theories like dessert. King James I, who inherited both the English and Scottish thrones like someone inheriting two very dysfunctional family businesses, had a deeply suspicious relationship with food. More specifically, fruit. He was convinced that anything freshly plucked from a tree or vine was, in essence, a botanical death wish. Apples? Sinful. Pears? Poison. Grapes? Suicide on a stem. Unless it had been baked, boiled, pickled, or otherwise murdered by heat, James wouldn't touch it. In an era where most people were more concerned about plague rats than peaches, James's paranoia around raw fruit might seem like garden-variety royal eccentricity. But to him, this wasn't just preference. It was policy. Court kitchens were instructed to boil and preserve all produce, resulting in meals that tasted more like medieval potpourri than anything remotely natural. His breakfasts were reportedly a slurry of dried and candied substances. Even salads, those rebellious leaves, were outlawed unless thoroughly scalded. Ironically, this fear of freshness came from a very Jamesian place, a blend of theology, pseudoscience, and personal disgust. He believed fruit carried vapors, invisible toxins that could slip past a man's defenses and rot him from the inside out. One contemporary doctor tried to explain vitamins to him, though they weren't called that yet, and James responded with something to the effect of, "Then let them be cooked into obedience." Subtlety was not his forte, and it wasn't just fruit. He loathed garlic, feared shellfish, and allegedly once made a bishop faint with a 4-hour lecture on the political implications of cheese. But fruit remained his great edible nemesis. He wrote letters warning nobles to avoid it unless they wanted to perish as the fool perishes, which, in his mind, apparently meant eating a raw apricot and dropping dead in disgrace. A nobleman's death by mango would have been the ultimate embarrassment. His fears weren't entirely unfounded, to be fair. In the 17th century, food safety was more a matter of hope than hygiene. Rotten fruit could carry disease, and refrigeration was as mythical as a well-behaved parliament. But James took his culinary paranoia to Shakespearean levels. At banquets, he would watch others eating fruit with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing cannibalism. Rumors spread that he once left a feast early because a servant had looked too closely at a fig. There's even an account, possibly apocryphal but emotionally accurate, that he demanded all fruit trees in one of his royal gardens be cut down after dreaming of being murdered by a plum. But this deep-seated fear didn't keep him from expressing his own tastes with flair. He adored candied orange peel, as long as it had been boiled several times over. He commissioned elaborate sugar sculptures in the shapes of biblical scenes, each one doubling as a way to consume fruit without technically eating it. To James, sugar wasn't a sweetener. It was a purifier, a kind of chemical exorcism for sinful food. You could almost picture him blessing a raisin with holy water before eating it. His obsession with culinary control mirrored his larger view of the world: order, hierarchy, purification. James was, after all, the monarch who commissioned the King James Bible, not because he was a spiritual visionary, but because he couldn't stand the theological chaos of competing interpretations. Everything had to be baked into submission, from doctrine to dessert. And yet, for all his royal authority, his food habits revealed a core of deep, almost childlike fear. The fruit was never just fruit. It was unpredictability. It was change. It was nature refusing to bow. A peach was an insult to monarchy because it ripened without permission. It's hard not to imagine him alone at night, pacing a velvet-draped dining room while servants prepared a bowl of thoroughly annihilated strawberries, whispering scripture under his breath. The king of two kingdoms, terrified of the garden. Of course, James's culinary dread wasn't just about food. Like everything with royals, it was symbolic. If a monarch couldn't trust a cherry, how could he trust a parliament? A plot? A papist? And sure enough, as his fruit suspicions deepened, so too did his political paranoia. He saw poison in everything, both in the bowl and in the court. So when you think of James I, don't picture the grand orator or the biblical reformer. Picture a man staring down an unbaked apple tart like it just insulted his mother. And yet, despite all the culinary control, all the boiling and preserving and ritualized eating, he never saw the real threats coming. The whispers in the halls, the conspiracies behind locked doors, the kind of rot no amount of sugar could hide. And speaking of people who couldn't stop themselves from consuming the worst possible things, let's talk about his successor in sweet-toothed self-destruction. A queen whose teeth rotted black from the inside out, and who still couldn't stop smiling. 2. Queen Elizabeth I. If sugar was a political strategy, then Queen Elizabeth I was playing a very long, very sticky game. The Virgin Queen, revered for her intellect and immortalized in powdered portraits and stiff ruffs, had a sweet tooth so monstrous it might have qualified as a diplomatic liability. She wasn't just fond of sugar, she was ruled by it, obsessed, enslaved, besotted, call it what you want. Elizabeth I didn't just enjoy sweets, she weaponized them. The Queen's love of sugar wasn't particularly strange by modern standards, but in the 16th century, sugar was not dessert. It was status. It was power, refined and crystallized. It was white gold, imported at great cost from colonized lands and processed into powders, pastes, and syrupy cures by desperate hands. To eat sugar daily was to flaunt your control over trade, labor, and disease. Elizabeth, never one to shy away from visual messaging, had her court dinners dripping in sugared fruits, candied violets, frosted marchpane sculptures, and elaborate edible portraits, often of herself. Nothing says divine right, quite like biting into a miniature version of your own face. Her dental situation became infamous. Observers described her blackened teeth in clinical, horrified tones, although in fairness that was more fashion than flaw at court. The nobility were so eager to mimic their monarch that rotting teeth actually became a trend. Members of court were known to paint their molars dark to appear as if they, too, had access to the kind of decadence that slowly killed you. It was possibly the only time in British history when gum disease was a flex. Elizabeth herself didn't seem to mind. She reportedly maintained her composure during state dinners even when her gums bled. Courtiers noted that she chewed on sugar lozenges during audiences, sometimes mid-sentence, as if sucking on diplomacy itself. She dined on sweetmeats between councils, ordered honey-glazed poultry during times of war, and drank clove-infused wine by the gallon. Her menus read like the fever dream of a pastry chef with diplomatic immunity. But her obsession wasn't just about taste. It was about power. Sugar was the edible form of political theater. In the Elizabethan court, banquets were not meals. They were orchestrated illusions. stage performances of abundance, control, and divine providence. To conjure delicacies from distant lands, to shape sweetened dough into symbols of peace or conquest, was to declare yourself not just ruler of England, but of nature, commerce, and time. Elizabeth's table was a map of the empire she dreamed of, rendered in icing. And still, the irony lingers. For all her control over appearances, Elizabeth's relationship with sugar revealed the one area where her discipline cracked. Behind closed doors, it was said she kept boxes of candied rose petals by her bedside. She reportedly requested preserved cherries even in winter when acquiring them required enormous effort and cost. One servant, with unfortunate candor, noted that she once flew into a fury when a shipment of marzipan failed to arrive on time, refusing to hold court until it was found. It wasn't just desserts. Elizabeth was known to have sugar added to meat dishes, sauces, even medicinal tonics. When her physicians warned her of its effects on her health, admittedly without the full modern understanding of diabetes, but still concerned, she dismissed them. "God will sweeten what man cannot," she supposedly quipped. It was a joke, but only barely. For a woman who reigned by myth and miracle, the idea that divine favor would neutralize tooth decay felt almost plausible. Some scholars argue that Elizabeth's sugar fixation was a form of comfort, an anchor in the chaos of political life. Unlike her ever-plotting counselors or her suitor-spamming inbox, sugar was predictable. It behaved. It obeyed. It gave her what no advisor could: certainty, pleasure, and the illusion of immortality. And maybe that's why she clung to it so fiercely, even as her teeth blackened and her jaw ached. Sugar didn't betray. Not like people. There's something poetic, and not in the good way, about a monarch devouring the very substance that was slowly undoing her body from the inside. And yet, in Elizabeth's court, suffering in silence was its own kind of performance. Power was never meant to look effortless. It was meant to look earned, bruised, and flavored with sacrifice. Her darkened smile became part of the theater, a glittering, painful mask. She wasn't entirely unaware of the irony. When foreign ambassadors noted her appearance, she leaned into it. Rumors spread that she applied white lead to her face to match her teeth. Some believe she deliberately highlighted her decay as a kind of twisted vanity. Look what I can endure. She didn't hide the cost of sovereignty. She chewed it, swallowed it, and asked for seconds. And so, as Elizabeth I ruled an empire with sugar-stained gloves and a sugar-rotted smile, one wonders, did she know she was devouring herself in the name of image? Probably. Did she care? Doubtful. She was too busy commanding storms, executing traitors, and ordering the next shipment of candied violets from Venice. Still, as her legacy hardened into legend, so too did her appetite, sweet, persistent, and quietly tragic. Because what's more Elizabethan than taking your vices and turning them into symbols of authority? And speaking of royals whose appetites defied reason, let's meet a man who believed a bird in the oven was worth more than a crown on the head, especially if it had its feathers reattached after roasting. And while Queen Elizabeth I was consulting the stars, her father was demanding they choose his battles for him. Apparently, ruling an empire isn't complete without a horoscope. If you're enjoying this royal descent into the wonderfully unhinged, make sure to subscribe. We've only just begun peeling back the ermine-trimmed madness. Also, quick question. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let me know in the comments. Because if you're listening to this at 2 a.m., you're officially in the right headspace. 3. King Henry VIII. If Henry VIII had been born in a more modest century, he might have ended up as a competitive eater or the star of an overly indulgent cooking show. But alas, He was born into monarchy. So instead of stuffing his face in private, he did it on gilded plates, in candlelit halls, with an orchestra playing while entire villages watched. Henry didn't just eat. He made feasting into a form of propaganda. And not the subtle kind. We're talking grand parades of roasted animals, sculptures made entirely of butter, pies hiding live birds. Yes, the nursery rhyme is probably based on him. And dinners that went on for so long they had built-in intermissions. The man didn't consume food, he choreographed it. At the center of this culinary theater was his particular obsession: swans and peacocks. Not merely cooked, but paraded, plucked, roasted, and then, like some Renaissance Frankenstein, redressed in their own feathers for maximum flair. These weren't meals. They were pageants. The kitchen would stitch the cooked bird's plumage back onto its body so it appeared alive again, resplendent in shimmering blue and white, sitting on a golden tray under chandeliers. Imagine an entire feast where the meat stares back at you, beautifully dead and theatrically defiant. For Henry, this wasn't morbid, it was majestic. And it didn't stop with birds. His banquets were notorious for featuring exotic meats, from boar to porpoise to the occasional stuffed cygnet. Records from court kitchens read less like a grocery list and more like a medieval zoo. One celebration, held for the birth of his son Edward, included over 2,000 dishes. A logistical nightmare, but a political masterstroke. Henry believed that fullness equaled strength. A well-fed court was a loyal court. An overfed court was a fearful one. There was symbolism in every bite. Peacocks represented vanity and majesty. Swans were purity and divine rule. Boars were brute power. These weren't just animals. They were edible metaphors for Henry himself. Beautiful, dangerous, and nearly impossible to digest. He didn't need propaganda posters. He had a dining room. Yet behind all the excess, there was a frantic kind of insecurity. Henry's endless appetite wasn't just for food. It was for legacy, power, permanence. He feared being forgotten almost as much as he feared being defied. Every banquet, every roast swan was a statement. I am here, I am glorious, and I will not be ignored. His weight, which ballooned in his later years, became its own kind of royal symbol. Unofficial, but unavoidable. He had to be hoisted onto horseback with mechanical lifts. He built extra-wide thrones. Even his suits of armor began to resemble kettle drums. He wasn't shrinking from view, he was expanding into legend. Even his kitchens were part of the myth-making. Hampton Court employed over 200 cooks, working round-the-clock shifts to keep the endless feasts going. Special pipes were installed to transport wine directly from the cellar to the banquet halls. Early plumbing with royal priorities. It wasn't a household. It was a gastronomic war machine. And perhaps most ironically of all, Henry's feasts often served as the backdrop for his darkest decisions. He announced annulments between courses, signed death warrants after dessert, toasted betrayals with imported wine. While his court gorged on spectacle, he quietly reshaped the English monarchy into something entirely new, absolutist, terrifying, and utterly dependent on his whims. The dining table was not separate from the throne. It was the throne. But maybe the strangest thing of all was how completely the court adapted to this absurd rhythm. Servants trained in synchronized carving. Musicians learned to modulate their playing based on digestion. Dishes were paraded in like royalty themselves, each one with a meaning, a purpose, a role to play in Henry's theater of consumption. So the next time you see a peacock, imagine it plucked, roasted, refeathered, and placed on a silver platter, carried into a hall echoing with music and ambition. Imagine Henry grinning behind his goblet, satisfied not just with the flavor, but with the message. He could eat the world and still ask for more. And if you think that sounds indulgent, Just wait until you meet the king who took his ale everywhere, including to war. Because what's honor on the battlefield without a few barrels of liquid courage rolled in behind you? 4. King James II, Scotland. There are men who bring swords into battle. There are those who bring strategy. And then there's James II of Scotland, the man who brought barrels of ale. To understand James II, you first have to let go of any notion that war, for him, was a solemn affair. It was violent, yes, chaotic certainly, but it was also somehow deeply domestic. Because wherever James went, be it to a council chamber, a military campaign, or a diplomatic procession, his ale followed. Not in a wineskin tucked discreetly beneath a cloak, but in actual barrels. Dozens of them, rolled along with the infantry, like thirsty wooden soldiers of their own. He was, in essence, the only monarch who viewed a battle camp the same way one might view a family picnic. Where others demanded swords, he asked for tankards. While most kings considered their standard-bearers to be the symbol of their strength, James's men often followed the clatter of oak casks being unloaded from carts. Strategy and supply lines were important, yes, but never as important as making sure the ale was safe, chilled, well, relatively, and ready. This wasn't just preference. It was ritual. James believed deeply in the morale-building power of strong drink. He considered ale not merely a beverage, but a kind of spiritual stabilizer. In a letter to a nobleman during one campaign, he wrote that ale stiffens the soul and anchors the mind, which, loosely translated, means he believed it gave soldiers the courage to do the impossible, or at least the deeply questionable. It's unclear when this devotion began. Some historians trace it to his adolescence, when he was forced to flee multiple castles during power struggles, often underdressed, underfed, and unwelcome. He associated the warm, bitter drink with home, its stability, its routine. In an uncertain kingdom where allegiances shifted like the wind, a mug of ale was at least reliable. Others suggest it was inherited from his father, or perhaps from the monastic communities who brewed the stuff in industrial quantities and often found themselves hosting royal fugitives. Either way, by the time James came into full authority, his preference had hardened into something more profound, a lifestyle. He funded royal breweries and kept personal ale masters. His private chambers reportedly smelled more like a tavern than a throne room. His cups were made not of gold, but of carved oak. During wartime, he had ale delivered to the front lines by cart, even when food supplies were dangerously low. At one infamous siege, he insisted on a shipment of strongest brown before approving a final attack. The barrels arrived just in time, and the castle fell shortly after. Coincidence? James didn't think so. Of course, not everyone shared his enthusiasm. Some military advisors warned that this devotion to drink blurred discipline. But James was unmoved. He believed that shared cups made for stronger bonds. That drink was the great equalizer, king and footman clinking mugs before a battle neither might survive. It was camaraderie brewed into foam. This also made him wildly popular among his troops. While other monarchs ruled through fear, James governed the battlefield through familiarity. He was known to pass through campfires at night, tankard in hand, offering casual toast to guards and squires alike. There's a story, told with great affection, that he once corrected a knight's stance not with a lecture, but with a refill. But behind the ale-soaked joviality was a king under siege, politically, emotionally, sometimes literally. He ruled a Scotland still reeling from instability, civil strife, and feuding clans. The ale was more than a drink. It was a psychological moat, separating James from the weight of his duties. Every mug poured was a buffer against betrayal. Every toast was a delay tactic. There's something deeply human in that, this strange blend of comfort, power, and self-medication. Where others buried their fears in prayer or conquest, James soaked his in hops and barley. And yet, for all his loyalty to ale, he never let it dull his instinct. He could be brutal when cornered, strategic when challenged, and, perhaps most impressively, charmingly coherent, even after what witnesses called a rather unreasonable amount of liquid optimism. James II didn't just march with barrels. He ruled with them. His reign was a procession of loyalty lubricated by drink, camaraderie served in oak, and decisions fermented under pressure. And if you think inhaling barrel-aged courage before breakfast is unusual, just wait until you meet the queen who made every meal a race. A monarch who believed that if you couldn't eat fast, you didn't deserve to eat at all. 5. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria didn't eat meals. She dispatched them, ruthlessly, efficiently, with all the romance of a military drill and the timing of a stopwatch. At first glance, this may seem like a minor quirk, just another royal eccentricity in a sea of powdered wigs and perfumed paranoia. But no. Victoria's speed-eating habit wasn't just fast. It was institutional, systemic, a policy disguised as a preference. When Queen Victoria dined, she didn't linger. She consumed. And when she was done, so were you, literally. According to long-standing royal protocol, the moment the monarch put down her fork, the course was considered finished, regardless of whether the rest of the table had even started. This wasn't metaphor, it was law. Her courtiers, guests, and visiting dignitaries learned very quickly that if they wanted to enjoy their roast duck or spring peas or whatever elaborate concoction the palace chefs had agonized over, they had to eat like their lives and careers depended on it. No second bites, no conversational pauses, no chewing with reflection. Just one eye on the queen and the other frantically tracking the plate before her. Because if she finished, if she took that final bite, dabbed her lips and nodded politely to the servant waiting in the wings, your dinner was gone, whisked away mid-chew, mid-sentence, mid-life. It's said that foreign guests were often warned ahead of time. Some practiced eating quickly in preparation. Others simply gave up and resorted to smuggling in sandwiches later. One poor ambassador from Italy reportedly had a full quail removed from his plate before he'd even pierced the skin. He was halfway through a compliment about the seasoning when a gloved hand reached over and carried it into oblivion. Victoria, for her part, seemed largely unbothered by the culinary chaos she inspired. She wasn't trying to be cruel, she was just efficient. Her days were scheduled down to the minute, and mealtimes were slotted in between meetings, inspections, correspondence, and, later in life, morning rituals so elaborate they practically needed stage managers. Food was sustenance, not ceremony. It served a function, like chairs or airs. And yet, her speed didn't mean she wasn't particular. Victoria had strong culinary preferences. She favored plain fare, disliked French cuisine, and preferred traditional English staples like roast beef and potatoes. Her tastes were famously conservative, but her rules? Absolutely tyrannical. If you dared request a slower pace or more time with your plate, you might be met with a look that could melt silverware. This fast-eating frenzy wasn't confined to formal dinners. Even breakfast was a race. Servants recalled her consuming toast and marmalade with mechanical speed. Afternoon tea? A blur of scones and judgment. Banquets became awkward endurance tests where the true aristocrats weren't the ones with titles, but the ones who could swallow without choking while keeping one eye on Her Majesty's teaspoon. The palace kitchens adapted. Dishes were prepared in ways that required minimal cutting or fuss. Everything was optimized for quick bites. Chefs learned not to take it personally when an entire course went untouched simply because the queen happened to feel unusually hungry that day. Timing, not taste, was the coin of the realm. Some historians believe Victoria's rushed eating was the result of lifelong discipline, an echo of her strict upbringing under the Kensington system, a suffocating regimen of rules, schedules, and enforced behavior. Others point to her temperament, pragmatic, No nonsense, emotionally restrained. But perhaps it was something simpler. Perhaps for a queen constantly under pressure to maintain decorum, empire, and family all at once, mealtimes were not a break, but just another performance to get through. There's something almost tragic in that image. A woman so burdened by duty that even the simplest pleasure of a warm meal became a task to complete, not an experience to savor. Power, for Victoria, meant motion. Stillness was vulnerability. Even at the dining table, she couldn't allow herself to linger, and yet those around her had to keep up or go hungry. Meals became metaphors. Eat quickly or be left behind. Adapt or be cleared from the table. And speaking of monarchs who blended indulgence with eccentricity, let's turn to the king who turned royal audiences into sugar-fueled snack breaks, his pockets stuffed with candied fruits and mischief. 6. King Charles II. Some kings carried swords. Charles II carried sugar. He didn't just snack, he schemed with sweets. While other monarchs tightened their lips behind solemn expressions and wax-sealed decrees, Charles unwrapped candied violets with the confidence of a man who knew diplomacy went down easier with a sugar glaze. In fact, his court was so infused with the scent of sugar and syrup that you'd be forgiven for thinking you'd wandered into a confectioner's shop instead of a monarchy rebuilt after civil war and regicide. It's not that Charles II merely liked sweets. Plenty of royals did. It's that he turned them into a lifestyle, a habit, a costume, a form of soft power, cloaked in molasses. He was known, famously, almost proudly, for keeping his pockets filled with sugary treats, candied fruits, spiced nuts, crystallized ginger, little balls of sweetened almonds, and rose petal preserves. He would offer them to courtiers during conversations, pass them to mistresses between whispered jests, and even hand out lozenges to diplomats like they were party favors. His pockets rustled when he walked. The royal robes, meant to carry orbs and scepters, instead carried the 17th century equivalent of a pick-and-mix bag. And no, this wasn't a phase. This was Charles II through and through. He'd slip sweets into his mouth mid-conversation with foreign envoys, chewing thoughtfully while they negotiated terms. He once paused a military discussion to search for a stray piece of candied orange peel, as if military readiness could wait for citrus. In court paintings, artists sometimes omitted the sweets, but eyewitnesses made sure history remembered. One ambassador described him as having a jovial countenance and the air of a man who enjoys his sugared comforts more than his sermons. There was something theatrical about it all. The Restoration Court, after all, wasn't just a political project, it was a sensory one. After years of Puritan rule and the stern gray purgatory of Oliver Cromwell's regime, Charles's return to the throne felt like England inhaling for the first time in a decade. Color, music, food, laughter, all flooded back into public life. And Charles led the charge like a man determined to eat the past out of his mouth. His love of sugar wasn't just symbolic, it was cultural repair. He restocked royal banquets with foreign confections. He encouraged trade with exotic sugar-producing colonies. He brought French pastry chefs to England and gave them royal patronage. Sugar was empire in granular form, and Charles knew how to wield it. But like many indulgent habits, there was a darker edge. His reliance on sweets mirrored his deeper struggle with moderation. Charles ruled with charm, not strictness, with indulgence, not denial. And while that made him a beloved figure to many, it also made him a frustrating one to his advisors, who often found themselves negotiating not just politics, but the whims of a monarch with a mouth full of candied plums. He was not a king of restraint. He was a king of appetite. Whether for luxury, affection, or Turkish delight, he believed in abundance. And yet, unlike some of his more tyrannical predecessors, Charles wielded his indulgences like tools of soft power. People let their guard down around a man who smiled through stickiness. He could disarm a room with a joke, a gift, and a fig dipped in honey. It was charm weaponized, and it worked. Servants reported that royal pockets had to be regularly cleaned to remove the sticky residue of forgotten sweets. At least once it caused a scandal when a court document was found smudged with syrup. He laughed it off, of course. Everything about Charles II was built on a philosophy of why not? Why not enjoy yourself? Why not lighten the mood? Why not keep a sugar stash in your coat during matters of state? Still, even charm curdles with time. Toward the end of his reign, whispers began about excessive spending, about court corruption, about the dangers of a monarch more interested in confections than constitutions. His sweet tooth, once endearing, began to look like a symptom. Was the sugar masking something? Boredom? Bitterness? Regret? Or was it simply who he was all along? A man unwilling to accept that kingship need be austere. Either way, it left a legacy. Charles II wasn't the king who rebuilt a nation through force. He did it through flavor, through laughter, through soft fingers slipping sugared almonds into the hands of those he wished to win over. And speaking of unusual breakfast habits and liquid comforts, let's meet a queen who believed water was far too suspicious to drink, especially before noon. Ale, on the other hand, perfectly reasonable, even at breakfast. 7. Mary, Queen of Scots. For Mary, Queen of Scots, breakfast wasn't just the most important meal of the day. It was an act of cautious survival. And in her mind, there was only one beverage fit for such an occasion. Ale. Yes, you read that correctly. While most people associate breakfast with tea, coffee, or perhaps the occasional celebratory mimosa, Mary began her mornings with a generous mug of strong Scottish ale, not watered-down table beer, not a polite sip from a pewter cup, a full, hearty draught, sometimes two. It wasn't indulgence, it was strategy. To her, water was deeply suspect, untrustworthy, even threatening. She called it dangerous, a word she used sparingly but with great conviction. And she wasn't entirely alone in this belief. In the 16th century Europe, clean drinking water was an elusive luxury. Rivers were tainted, wells were inconsistent, and indoor plumbing was centuries away from being anything more than a leaking hope. But even within that context, Mary's rejection of water stood out. She didn't just avoid it, she condemned it. She actively chose fermentation over filtration. Ale, she believed, had been proven by fire. Brewed, boiled, and blessed by time and heat, it was cleaner, safer, and, perhaps most importantly, less likely to kill her. In a court full of whispering nobles, questionable alliances, and a historical track record of assassinations disguised as stomach aches, Mary's logic had a certain grim elegance. You can't poison someone through water if they never drink it. Her devotion to ale wasn't limited to morning rituals. It was woven into her daily routine. Servants recalled that barrels were kept in every royal residence she occupied. When she traveled, her ale went with her, carefully selected from preferred breweries, many of them run by local monks. At her request, special blends were developed, tailored to her tastes. Mildly bitter, low in sediment, served slightly warm. Cold beer, she believed, was for Englishmen and fools. Visitors to her court were often surprised, some even scandalized, by the sight of a queen sipping ale in the early morning light, often before sunrise. But Mary didn't apologize. She'd nod politely, raise her cup, and explain in that measured tone of hers that a woman who would rule must know the tools of her health, which, in this case, apparently included malted barley. There was also, no doubt, a ceremonial aspect to it. Drinking ale connected her to the Scottish people, many of whom saw her as a foreign-born queen more French than Highlander. Her ale ritual grounded her, culturally, politically, even spiritually. It was a gesture of familiarity, a nod to tradition in a reign otherwise marked by volatility and exile. But make no mistake, Her relationship with ale wasn't romantic. It wasn't poetic. It was practical. In a world where water might kill you and wine might loosen your tongue, ale was the perfect middle ground, sober enough to govern, strong enough to sterilize, and perhaps symbolic in a deeper way. Mary was a woman trapped in perpetual defense of her crown, her choices, her very legitimacy. Every gesture had to be calculated, every pleasure justified. The ale wasn't just a drink, it was a statement. I will not be undone by what others swallow without thinking. Of course, her critics found ways to weaponize even this. Rumors spread that her dependence on ale made her brash, made her weak, made her too masculine in behavior. As always, a powerful woman with habits outside the narrow script was seen as dangerous, not because she was indulgent, but because she refused to apologize. Mary never tried to explain herself. She simply kept drinking. And as we shift from a queen who trusted only in fermented grains to a monarch who trusted no one, including his own stomach, you'll meet a man whose dinners were not acts of nourishment, but extravagant declarations. Because when one banquet isn't enough, why not order 3? 8. King George IV. If gluttony could wear a crown, it would look suspiciously like George IV. While many royals have indulged, George made it an art form, a spectacle, a national concern. He didn't simply eat to live, nor live to eat. He consumed like a man trying to fill an existential void with gravy. Meals weren't meals. They were operas, dramatic, bloated, costumed, and always far too long. Officially, George IV began his reign as a king. Unofficially, he was already infamous as the Prince of Excess. His daily routine often included several multi-course meals, all rich, all elaborate, and all staggeringly unnecessary. Breakfast might start late but would drag on for hours. By noon he'd be mulling over lunch menus. And by dinner? The table groaned under the weight of it all. He didn't just order one dinner. Some evenings he ordered 3, and not in a row, simultaneously. One might be French-inspired, with truffled game and sauces so dense they had their own gravitational pull. Another might lean into English roasts, pies, and puddings, hearty enough to defeat lesser men. A third might flirt with exotic flavors, imported spices, or whatever delicacy the colonies had shipped in that week. George didn't choose between them. He simply had them all laid out and wandered between tables like a decadent ghost in a Versailles-themed buffet. Servants had to develop new methods just to track what he consumed. Entire kitchens were devoted to his needs. Special furniture was built to support both him and his dishes. Chairs reinforced with iron braces, sideboards that could accommodate hundreds of pounds of porcelain and silver. One steward noted that George had the appetite of a lion and the digestion of a regrettable experiment. His waistline ballooned accordingly. By middle age, he was rumored to weigh over 300 pounds, a number whispered more as a cautionary tale than an insult. His body reportedly swelled out of uniforms, out of beds, out of metaphors. He once had to commission a custom-built carriage not for comfort, but because no standard door frame could accommodate him. But unlike other royals who might hide such extravagance, George flaunted it. He hosted banquets that blurred the line between dining and theater. Candles dripped from chandeliers shaped like grapevines. Waiters dressed in silk livery carried dishes sculpted into mythological scenes. Ice cream came molded as ancient ruins. Even the jelly was dramatic, often layered, jeweled, and glistening like a warning. Guests didn't eat so much as survive. And yet, George didn't see this as excess. To him, it was royal legitimacy. A king should be larger than life, in appetite, in presence, in waistband. His table was the stage upon which he reasserted his status, especially as political power began slipping toward Parliament. If he couldn't rule the government, he'd rule the menu, ferociously. And this wasn't just a private performance. George made a point of public eating. He allowed foreign dignitaries and courtiers to observe his feasts, to witness the scale of his hunger. He dined as if posterity were watching. And in a way, it was. His food rituals became national gossip. Satirists portrayed him as a bloated clown with turkey legs in both hands. Pamphlets listed his daily calorie intake like a moral indictment. But George, to his credit, or perhaps to his obliviousness, remained unbothered. He was the monarch of more, the sovereign of seconds. He once reportedly remarked, "The people may criticize, but they do not cook." Still, the toll was real. His health declined, and his public image shifted from lavish to grotesque. He became more reclusive, but never less indulgent. His final years were marked by pain, gout, and isolation. But the dining continued. Slower, perhaps, but no less dramatic. He once had an entire roast swan prepared just to prove he still could. In the end, George IV didn't just eat like a king, he ruled like a man trying to outrun mortality one course at a time. And if the banquet table was his throne, then he sat on it proudly, aching knees, full belly, and all. And speaking of royal obsessions that went just a little too far, let's rewind a few centuries to meet a king who fell in love with something far slipperier than power. A delicacy so bizarre, so oddly specific, that it may have led him straight to his grave. 9. Henry I, England. Every royal has a weakness. For some, it's power. For others, it's legacy. For Henry I, it was lampreys. Yes, lampreys. Those eel-like, jawless creatures that look like they escaped from a medieval bestiary and slithered straight into a nightmare. Slippery, boneless, and mostly mouth, they were considered an elite delicacy in medieval Europe. To the average person, they looked like something you'd club with a stick if it crawled too close to your campfire. But to Henry I, they were culinary ecstasy, a strange, oily luxury he couldn't get enough of. By all accounts, Henry wasn't just fond of lampreys. He was obsessed with them. They weren't an occasional treat or a seasonal indulgence. They were a fixture of his diet, a kind of royal signature dish. While other monarchs feasted on boar, swan, or pastries shaped like castles, Henry demanded lampreys. Braised, spiced, stewed in wine. He even had royal cooks develop specific spice blends and preparation methods to keep the flavor regal. If modern monarchs had signature fragrances, Henry had a signature fish. Now, to be fair, lampreys were considered prestigious in the 12th century. The church even allowed them during fasts because they weren't technically meat, which led to a bizarre loophole where nobles would gorge themselves on lamprey feasts during supposed periods of religious restraint. But Henry went well beyond social convention. For him, lampreys weren't just a delicacy, they were a craving. He would have them delivered to his royal residences in enormous quantities, carted in from rivers across England and Normandy. Chroniclers mention entire shipments of lampreys being delayed due to weather, followed by royal fury when the supply ran low. His cooks became specialists in preparing them, and some were knighted purely on the strength of their kitchen skills. One court scribe even claimed Henry had dreams in which lampreys spoke to him, though historians generously file that under metaphor. Probably. The obsession became so pronounced that it developed its own mythology. When Henry visited a new town, local nobles would rush to provide him with fresh lampreys as a gesture of loyalty. Cities near rivers tried to brand themselves as lamprey capitals. The fish became currency in courtly favor. It was a royal delicacy, yes, but also a bizarre form of diplomacy. And then, one winter evening in 1135, the lampreys may have finally claimed their king. According to multiple chroniclers, Henry, against the advice of his physicians, indulged in a particularly large and rich helping of lampreys. They warned him not to. He did it anyway. Whether out of habit, stubbornness, or sheer delight, he consumed what was later described as a surfeit of lampreys. Shortly afterward, he fell ill. Some accounts say he died within days. Others suggest a slower decline. Either way, the consensus remains oddly specific. The lampreys didn't just nourish him. They outlasted him. Now, was it really the lampreys that did him in? Possibly. Possibly not. Medieval medicine was, to put it generously, unreliable. And death by lamprey makes for a neater historical footnote than death by 20 unverified causes. But the symbolism is irresistible. A king so enamored with his personal obsession that it literally consumed him. And what a legacy to leave behind. Henry I, consolidator of power, administrator of justice, builder of the Anglo-Norman state, and man who allegedly lampreyed himself to death. It's the sort of detail that sticks, unfairly but permanently. You could conquer kingdoms, but the public will always remember your weirdest dinner. Of course, the irony doesn't end there. For years after his death, royal chefs continued to prepare lampreys in his honor during court banquets. It became a tradition. Serve the fish, toast the king, try not to perish. Even today, the city of Gloucester still presents lampreys to the monarch on special occasions, like a strange inside joke between centuries. So the next time you pass by a river and see something slithering beneath the water, remember, for one English king, that creature wasn't a menace. It was dinner and destiny. And if you think that was a bit excessive, wait until you meet the monarch who treated every meal like a 12-act opera, with more courses than some countries had laws, and no intention of stopping at just one sitting. 10. King Edward VII. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a royal appetite transcends mere hunger and becomes a lifestyle, a brand, and a political mood, look no further than King Edward VII. Edward didn't just eat to excess. He ate like someone trying to assert dominance over time itself. His meals were not just meals. They were events, and not one of them was optional. He was famous, and often quietly feared, for his daily ritual of consuming 7 to 8 extravagant courses per sitting. And here's the real twist. He didn't limit himself to just one sitting. Breakfast was a warm-up. Lunch was a dress rehearsal. Dinner was where the main act happened. And if the mood struck, midnight supper. There was no such thing as moderation in the Edwardian court, at least not while Edward was at the table. The king operated on a kind of gastro clock, where hours were measured not by chimes, but by courses. To dine with Edward VII was to embark on a culinary expedition. Meals stretched for hours. Pacing was crucial. Palate cleansers appeared between courses like intermission acts. There were hors d'oeuvres, soups, fish, roasts, game, cold courses, puddings, cheeses, fruits, and finally, liqueurs. Each dish carefully curated and often rich enough to require its own seat at the table. Menus from his reign read like novels. At one banquet, the offerings included oysters, turtle soup, lobster à la Parisienne, duck with orange sauce, roast pheasant, foie gras with truffles, and 12 separate dessert options. This wasn't exceptional. It was standard. His culinary court was meticulously maintained. He kept a team of chefs that included the now legendary Auguste Escoffier, whose influence on French cuisine lives on today. Together, they curated meals that walked the line between luxury and absurdity. There was even a dining rule, reportedly enforced by Edward himself. No sauce should ever be served in moderation. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about volume. But Edward's feasting wasn't a matter of indulgence alone. It was a form of soft diplomacy. At the table, he built alliances, smoothed over scandals, disarmed rivalries with a clink of a wineglass and a perfectly timed anecdote. He was known for making guests laugh between bites of duck confit and for slipping political hints between courses. He didn't negotiate in cold chambers. He did it over veal medallions and brandy. There was an odd elegance to it all. Despite his size, he grew rotund in middle age, Edward remained dapper, regal, and oddly graceful. He wore his appetite the way he wore his tailored suits, confidently and without apology. His ever-expanding waistline became an iconic silhouette, and his dining habits were so legendary that chefs named dishes after him. Filet de sole Edward VII was a real thing. So was poulet reine, a chicken dish made to his specifications. If he liked something, it didn't just go on the menu. It entered the culture. And of course, there were side effects. Medical complaints followed him like a discreet entourage. Gout, indigestion, fatigue. But none of it deterred him. If anything, it added a tragicomic layer to his persona. The king who knew better but ate anyway. A man so committed to consumption that even common sense had to wait for dessert. Even his chairs were custom-built. Not for posture, but for space. Palace tailors made his trousers with hidden expanders. One favorite dining jacket was reportedly designed with a subtle slit along the sides, so he could eat freely without restriction. No metaphor needed. But underneath the opulence was something sharper. Edward VII lived much of his life in waiting, decades spent as the heir to Queen Victoria's never-ending reign. By the time he became king, he was already 59. He knew his rule would be short, and so he lived accordingly, at full tilt. Every meal, every toast, every cigar afterward was seized with the urgency of someone who'd waited too long and didn't plan to wait again. He dined like a man making up for lost time, and everyone else had to keep up or be forgotten. And speaking of royal habits that blurred the line between delicacy and danger, let's now look at the monarch whose breakfast choice wasn't a meal, but a matter of doctrine. A ruler so devoted to routine that even his breakfast drink became a manifesto. 11. Queen Elizabeth I. Yes, again. Because when it comes to Queen Elizabeth I, once simply isn't enough. Monarch, strategist, icon, and now, appearing in her second act on this list, as a woman with a hygiene regimen that would make a medieval dungeon seem positively sparkling by comparison. To be fair, Elizabeth's era wasn't known for its cutting-edge hygiene. The 16th century had not yet discovered germ theory, plumbing was reserved for the luckiest of castles, and bathing was still debated as either a virtue or a health risk. But even by those standards, Elizabeth stood out. She famously boasted of having only taken a handful of baths in her entire life. A point of pride, not confession. As the story goes, she once said she bathed once a month, whether I need it or not. Most historians suspect even that was generous. Her logic? Water was untrustworthy. The prevailing medical opinion of the day held that bathing could open the body's pores to disease, like standing in a rainstorm and inviting the plague to come inside for tea. Instead, Elizabeth preferred what her contemporaries called dry washing, a euphemism for being vigorously rubbed down with cloths soaked in scented oils, rose water, or vinegar. It masked the odor. It didn't remove it. Still, her courtiers were unlikely to complain. Not because they didn't notice. There are reports that suggest the Queen's chambers were thick with a heady cocktail of perfume, sweat, and the unmistakable scent of too much velvet worn too long, but because saying anything could cost you more than your nose. Criticizing the Queen's habits was a fast track to exile, disgrace, or something worse. So they smiled, they bowed, they held their breath. The irony here is biting. Elizabeth was meticulous about image. Her face powdered to perfection with dangerous white lead. Her gowns grander than staircases. Her ruffs wide enough to need clearance when entering a room. She crafted a public persona so carefully that it took on mythic proportions. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the living embodiment of divine monarchy. And yet, beneath all that symbolism, all that iconography, was a woman who didn't trust a bathtub. Her fear of bathing may have also been practical. Elizabeth lived in an age where assassination was a daily concern, And even something as simple as slipping into hot water could be a vulnerability. A bath meant privacy, exposure, risk, no armor, no attendants, no escape. To soak in a tub was to surrender control, and Elizabeth, above all, never did that. There's also the matter of precedent. Monarchs before her had fallen ill after bathing. Some had died shortly after. Whether or not there was any real connection didn't matter. Rumors became tradition. And Elizabeth ruled as much through symbolism as through statute. If avoiding baths kept her alive, or at least gave the impression of invincibility, she wasn't about to question it. She compensated in other ways. Her wardrobe was a fortress. Layers upon layers of embroidered fabric, perfume pouches, and jewels to draw the eye away from anything that might suggest vulnerability or, frankly, body odor. She was a master of redirecting attention. If you're dazzled by the crown, you won't notice the lack of soap. By all accounts, Elizabeth was still considered captivating well into old age. Her charisma was unshakable. Her voice was commanding. Her presence could silence a room, and it often did, whether from awe or lack of ventilation. It's worth noting that her court wasn't alone in this. Cleanliness, in the modern sense, was an alien concept to most of Europe's elite. But Elizabeth took it to extremes. In a world where monarchs could do whatever they pleased, she chose austerity over indulgence, caution over comfort. She lived a life defined by restraint, right down to her pores. So the next time someone praises her for being England's most powerful queen, remember, she ruled an empire, defeated the Spanish Armada, and rewrote the rules of monarchy, all while refusing to take a proper bath. And from queens who shunned water to kings who shunned changing their clothes entirely, we move now to a monarch whose commitment to his wardrobe reached levels that were equal parts alarming and unwashed. 12. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England. There are many ways to measure power: decrees, crowns, armies. And then there's King James VI of Scotland, who measured his by how long he could go without changing his clothes. Spoiler, it was a while. James VI, who later became James I of England, after the death of Elizabeth I, whose cleanliness habits we've just marveled at, brought with him more than just the idea of a unified crown. He also brought a deeply committed and utterly perplexing approach to personal hygiene that involved not bathing regularly, not changing his garments for months at a time, and occasionally sleeping in the same clothes he'd worn to court, to dinner, to meetings, and possibly to minor wars. To call him unkempt would be generous. His wardrobe choices weren't about poverty or protest. They were about conviction. James had an entrenched belief that frequent washing, or, more alarmingly, frequent disrobing, was bad for the body and the soul. This was a man who saw cleanliness not as next to godliness, but as dangerously close to death. His fear of baths was, like Elizabeth's, tied to the popular medical theories of the time. The belief went something like this: bathing opens the pores invite disease, and disease equals doom. Clothes, by contrast, were seen as protective layers, almost like a second skin. Changing them too often was like peeling off your natural defenses. In this logic, remaining in the same outfit for weeks was an act of health preservation. It was a theory built more on superstition than science. But when you're king, you don't need footnotes. Eyewitness accounts described James's court as fragrant. Servants reportedly dreaded the task of assisting with his garments, not just because they were often stiff from wear, but because removing them could trigger sneezing fits, nausea, or existential dread. Fabrics would yellow, collars would stiffen, and waistcoats took on the texture of parchment. And still, he persisted. Even more surprising, James didn't appear to be embarrassed by any of it. In fact, he seemed almost indifferent to how he was perceived physically. While he was famously eloquent, writing treatises on everything from witchcraft to tobacco. He was equally famous for his disinterest in appearances. Clothes were a formality, not a fashion, a necessity, not a statement. When pressed, he reportedly quipped, "A king's mind need not dwell on such trivial matters," which is rich coming from the man who wrote an entire book condemning smoking. But here's the paradox. Despite his aversion to changing clothes, James was obsessed with control and ritual. He micromanaged court affairs, published moral codes, and demanded strict adherence to religious ceremony. His refusal to update his outfit was not a rebellion. It was, somehow, part of his method. Routine to James was sacred. Predictability was stability. What looked to others like neglect was, in his mind, a form of spiritual discipline. And perhaps that's why no one dared challenge him directly. Even though ambassadors whispered and courtiers winced, James was the one with the crown and the pen. His words could shape kingdoms, even if his sleeves smelled like last November. Strangely, this contradiction between mental sharpness and physical dishevelment only added to his mystique. He was brilliant, bizarre, and often ahead of his time, just not in the hygiene department. He wrote extensively, united crowns, survived assassination plots, and helped solidify the Stuart dynasty, all while wearing the same shirt until it could stand up on its own. And yet, for all his intellectual achievements, what remains in many records is the detail of his rumpled doublet and his reluctance to part with a favorite coat. He became the embodiment of a king who lived in his own head, so much so that his body was treated as an afterthought. So when we look back at James VI or the First, we see a man of contradictions, the scholarly sovereign who feared witches, the eloquent thinker who scorned soap, and the monarch who united two kingdoms while refusing to rotate his wardrobe. And speaking of royals with peculiar bedtime companions, let's now visit a queen whose definition of comfort during illness wasn't silk sheets or feather pillows, but something far more alive, loyal, and unexpectedly furry. 13. Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary. History remembers Mary the Rush of England by her sobriquet, Bloody Mary, a name soaked in political violence and religious fire. But less remembered, and equally curious in its own quiet way, was her steadfast devotion to one of the most unusual royal comfort objects imaginable, her dogs. Specifically, the fact that she shared her bed with them. Routinely, obsessively, sometimes even when she was gravely ill. To be clear, dogs in royal courts were nothing new. Monarchs have always had pets, symbols of status, affection, and occasionally taxidermy projects in the making. But Mary's bond with her canines wasn't performative or symbolic. It was deeply personal. Her dogs weren't palace accessories. They were family. And she didn't just keep them in her chambers, she slept beside them, every night. No matter the season, no matter her health, and no matter what the royal physicians said about it, which for the record was, "Please stop." At the height of her reign, Mary's bedchamber wasn't just the private quarters of a sovereign. It was a full-time kennel. Small spaniels and lapdogs were her preferred companions, and she kept multiple. They were brushed, perfumed, and swaddled in silk-lined bedding. Some were known by name at court. One was famously brought to her wedding procession, nestled in a velvet cushion. Another, historians claim, once bit a foreign ambassador and was then rewarded with extra treats. Because of course it was. Mary's canine closeness escalated particularly during times of personal distress. When she was ill, whether with fever, grief, or one of her mysterious phantom pregnancies, she insisted on having her dogs in bed with her. Not at the foot of the bed. Not nearby. With her. Nestled beneath the covers, sometimes under her arms, occasionally pressed close to her chest. Physicians objected. Courtiers whispered. But Mary refused to part with them. To understand this attachment, you need to look at the rest of her life. Mary's childhood was filled with betrayal and rejection. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was cast aside by Henry VIII. Mary was declared illegitimate, cut from the line of succession, and subjected to humiliations that would have broken most people by age 15. Her adolescence was a blur of political instability and psychological isolation. In a world of backstabbing advisors and conditional affections, dogs, predictable, loyal, non-political dogs, were the only comfort she could count on. So when she finally took the throne, it was as a woman already emotionally scarred. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was more strategic than romantic. Her reign was embattled from the start, and when her body failed to produce an heir, a deep personal shame she carried in silence, her dogs were the only ones allowed close enough to hear her sigh. This was not eccentricity for the sake of court gossip. It was emotional survival. Mary's dogs were her retreat, her warmth, her security blanket wrapped in fur. Even when she was bedridden, battling illness, she clung to them as though they might anchor her to life itself. And for a while, maybe they did. Her physicians, naturally, hated it. They cited concerns about hygiene, about heat, about the corrupt vapors released by animals sharing confined air. They recommended her dogs be kept outside the bedroom. She dismissed them with a glare. One courtier recalled that suggesting she sleep without her dogs earned him the Queen's disfavor, which did not lift for some weeks. The man was lucky to keep his position. What makes this detail all the more haunting is its contrast with her public image. To the outside world, Mary was severe, cold, iron-willed, a queen defined by fire and martyrdom. But behind the curtain, under the heavy Tudor covers, lay a woman curled up beside a spaniel, listening to its breath, seeking comfort in the quiet, unconditional companionship that no courtier, bishop, or king could offer her. There is something profoundly human, tragically so, about that image. A queen made monstrous by history, remembered for executions and religious zeal, who fell asleep each night surrounded not by gold or titles, but by the soft weight of sleeping animals. And if that image isn't strange enough, we now turn to her contemporary, a king so determined in his devotions that he practically made cleanliness illegal by example. A monarch whose faith may have been deep, but whose soap stayed suspiciously untouched. 14. King Henry VI. Some kings were warriors, some were politicians. Henry VI was neither. He was something else entirely, a monkish soul trapped in a crown, a man whose deepest commitment wasn't to war, power, or even governance, but to piety, unflinching, uncomfortable, and at times profoundly unhygienic piety. Henry VI is remembered, when he's remembered at all, as the quiet king. Quiet in temperament, quiet in action, and unfortunately, quietly offensive in scent. Because while other monarchs occasionally skipped baths due to superstition or schedule, Henry seemed to skip them out of principle. He believed that cleanliness, particularly bodily cleanliness, was a distraction from the spiritual life, a form of vanity, an indulgence. In other words, the dirtier the soul felt, the more righteous he believed it became. He didn't just neglect bathing, he almost avoided it. His attendants, many of whom were used to the rigorous grooming expectations of the medieval court, were appalled. Not just because their king wasn't adhering to the standards of noble hygiene, but because he didn't seem to notice or care that anyone else might mind. Servants recorded that his linens had to be changed more often than his robes, simply because the clothes remained on for long stretches. He avoided scented oils, rejected powdered wigs, later fashionable, and seemed confused by the entire concept of personal fragrance. Why would a man of God need to smell like lavender? To be clear, Henry wasn't lazy. He was devout, painfully so. He saw the royal life as a spiritual test, and anything pleasurable, like a hot bath or perfumed towel, was viewed as a trap for the soul. He preferred fasting to feasting, silence to celebration, and meditation to administration. His court, when he could be bothered to hold one, had the energy of a monastery with better drapes. His rejection of hygiene wasn't just a personal quirk. It had real consequences. Diplomats found audiences with him to be disorienting. Foreign envoys wrote home in increasingly polite euphemisms, describing the king as ascetic, withdrawn, or cloaked in humble manner. These were diplomatic code phrases for "the king doesn't wash." His court began to develop a reputation, not of decadence, but of discomfort. Visitors to Windsor or Westminster often commented on the austere atmosphere, the silent halls, and the curious absence of soap. And yet, perhaps the most peculiar part of all this is how consistent Henry was. Through civil unrest, political uprisings, and eventual deposition, he remained devoted to this way of living. Even in captivity, when he was briefly imprisoned during the Wars of the Roses, he maintained his strange ascetic rituals, refused meat, read scriptures, slept on uncomfortable bedding, and, of course, continued to forego any regular washing. This created tension with his contemporaries, particularly those who expected the monarch to lead not only with piety, but with presence. And presence, especially in medieval Europe, was at least partially defined by how tolerable it was to sit next to you in court. Henry made that difficult. His physical withdrawal from the world mirrored his emotional one. He ruled like a man who never asked to rule, who regarded kingship as a burden rather than an opportunity. And nothing expressed that more than his refusal to even pretend he cared about appearances. But make no mistake, this wasn't harmless eccentricity. Henry's behavior had real political implications. His lack of charisma, his absence from court life, and his distaste for all the ceremonial aspects of royalty helped destabilize his reign. His neglect wasn't just of his body, it extended, tragically, to his throne. Still, there's something haunting about him. A man born into one of the most turbulent eras of English history, gifted a crown he didn't want, and responding by disappearing inward, not in opulence, not in madness, but in a kind of holy neglect. As if the further he removed himself from worldly things, even soap, the closer he felt to salvation. And speaking of monarchs with unsettling interests and even more unsettling routines, let's visit a king whose skincare routine included balms taken from corpses, because apparently nothing says divine right like borrowing your glow from the grave. 15. King Charles II. If there were ever a monarch who understood the importance of performance, it was Charles II. Known as the Merry Monarch, he returned to the throne of England in 1660 like an actor arriving late to a play that had gone off script without him. With Cromwell's puritanical intermission finally over, Charles brought laughter, theater, fashion, and unapologetic flair back to royal life. But among his many eccentricities, his sweet tooth, his mistresses, his lavish court, one of his most peculiar habits was not public at all. He liked to watch corpses being dissected, and more than that, he liked to collect things from them. Charles was fascinated with medicine, particularly with anatomy, alchemy, and the half-baked science that passed for early modern healthcare. It wasn't enough for him to support physicians. He wanted to be one, or at least play one. He had a personal laboratory at Whitehall Palace filled with alembics, retorts, and jars of strange substances. He read medical texts, studied herbal lore, and kept an inner circle of apothecaries and surgeons. So far, still within the bounds of curious kingship. Monarchs have always dabbled in the sciences, particularly when the sciences made them feel more in control of their mortality. But Charles took it a step further. He would personally attend dissections. He invited surgeons to cut open cadavers in his presence, sometimes criminals, sometimes unclaimed bodies from the poorer districts of London, and watched the proceedings with a kind of serene detachment. According to court reports, he asked detailed questions. He made notes. He once corrected a physician mid-dissection. citing a Latin text to support his view. But the strangest part came after. Charles believed that the human body contained certain essential oils and vital spirits that could be extracted and reused. It was an idea floating around among the alchemists and early chemists of the time, a belief that health, even vitality itself, could be bottled. So, when dissections ended, Charles would ask for portions of the oils and balms used in the preservation process. In some cases, he requested substances taken directly from the body, resins, salves, anything that might have touched what he called life's essence. These would then be added to his private collection of medicinal mixtures, which he occasionally applied to his own skin. That's right. The King of England treated his royal complexion with salves believed to have absorbed life energy from the deceased. To modern ears, this sounds ghoulish. But to Charles, it was cutting-edge wellness, the Restoration-era equivalent of anti-aging serum. He wasn't trying to be creepy. He was trying to cheat time. Charles saw the body as a kind of divine machine, filled with secrets. If you could understand its components, blood, bone, breath, you could master illness, delay decay, maybe even skirt death. His doctors, to their credit, humored him. After all, it's hard to say no to a monarch who thinks he's invented immortality. And besides, his fascination wasn't entirely without merit. Charles also established the Royal Society, one of the most significant scientific institutions in British history. He funded research, encouraged intellectual debate. He just also happened to moisturize with cadaver balm on the side. Court insiders whispered about it. Ambassadors pretended not to notice. And artists, ever respectful of legacy, politely left those details out of his portraits. But behind the velvet curtains and the powdered wigs, there was a king dabbing tinctures on his skin and muttering about humors and ether. It was all part of his broader philosophy. Live brilliantly, die never. Even if that meant getting uncomfortably close to the dead in order to do so. And from a king who sought vitality in the oils of the departed, we now move to a queen whose obsession with warmth took a more domestic form, one that lived quietly beneath her skirts no matter the season. 16. Queen Anne. If Queen Anne was remembered only for her politics, she would be one of the more forgettable monarchs in British history. Her reign, though crucial in the development of constitutional monarchy, was overshadowed by louder figures on either side, William and Mary before her, George I after. But delve past the parliamentary acts and succession crises, and you'll discover a royal quirk that stands in warm, cozy contrast to the usual sword-rattling and throne-threatening. Queen Anne had an obsession with foot warmers, and not in a passing way. Not a bring-one-in during a snowstorm sort of habit. We're talking year-round, ritualized, logistically complex, and frankly, kind of adorable levels of obsession. Wherever she went, foot warmers followed. Under her gowns, beneath the banquet tables, hidden inside her carriages. Even on occasion, smuggled into church services where open flames were technically frowned upon. But Anne, it seemed, preferred the threat of singed silk to the horror of cold toes. It became something of a court routine. The queen would enter a room, and within moments, a servant would discreetly slide a foot warmer under her voluminous skirts. These weren't electric, obviously. This was the early 18th century, but they were elaborate devices nonetheless. Brass, copper, occasionally wood-lined, filled with hot coals or heated stones, and often wrapped in velvet to match the decor. Some were perfumed with rose oil or lavender, in case the warming also released less desirable odors from beneath the gowns. And it wasn't just one warmer. She frequently kept multiple within reach, one under each foot, a spare on hand, occasionally one placed near her lap or beside her elbows. It was less about efficiency and more about emotional insurance. If warmth was available, why limit yourself? So why the obsession? Theories vary. Some blame her notoriously fragile health. Anne suffered from a lifetime of ailments, gout, dropsy, and chronic joint pain. Warmth soothed her. or at least gave her the illusion of control over a body that so frequently defied her. Other historians point to her repeated pregnancies, at least 17, none resulting in a surviving heir, which left her physically weakened and psychologically exhausted. In that context, the foot warmers weren't luxury. They were comfort, stability, a small bit of certainty in a life filled with loss. Then there's the emotional side. Anne was known to be shy, deeply private, and prone to melancholy. Her few close friendships, like the famously complicated one with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, were intense, emotional, and sometimes destructive. She craved loyalty, security. And while a foot warmer can't solve a political crisis, it doesn't betray you either. Whatever the reasons, her need for warmth became part of royal routine. Furniture was redesigned to accommodate heat sources. Carriage interiors were modified. Court architects were even instructed to install fire vent channels beneath certain thrones and benches. Discreetly, of course. You couldn't have the Queen's desire for toasty feet become too obvious. Though, in reality, everyone knew. It was part of her image. Queen Anne, the ruler who needed warmth the way others needed crowns. And yet, this simple fixation gives us a rare glimpse into the human side of monarchy. Forget wars and parliaments. Imagine being a queen whose day genuinely started and ended with a servant checking the temperature of a copper box filled with stones. She wasn't dramatic like Elizabeth, nor decadent like Charles. Anne was quiet, subtle. But her legacy, an act of union, the rise of the two-party system, and the foundations of modern Britain, was forged in a life wrapped in blankets and warmed from the ground up. And as strange as that might sound, it's perhaps no stranger than the monarch who followed her in spirit. A king who recoiled not from cold but from touch itself. A ruler so averse to physical contact that even his own doctors were kept at arm's length, permanently. 17. King James I. If King James I had a personal motto, it might have been, "Look, but don't touch." Known for uniting the crowns of England and Scotland in 1603, James brought with him a towering intellect, a talent for scholarship, a flair for dramatic speech-making, and an unwavering, deeply personal rule. No one was allowed to touch him, not his courtiers, not his servants, not even his physicians. In a time when monarchs were accustomed to being groomed, dressed, and physically attended to by an army of hands, James stood apart as something of a paradox. He loved courtly ceremony, grand entrances, the pomp of being watched. But if you tried to get physically close, the party ended, quickly. Historians and biographers alike have struggled to pin down where this aversion came from. Some attribute it to a traumatic childhood. James was separated from his mother Mary, Queen of Scots, as a baby and raised under a strict, often isolating Scottish regency. Others believe it stemmed from his lifelong health problems, which included arthritis, weak limbs, and chronic digestive issues. But whatever the origin, the result was consistent. James did not want to be touched. Ever. This wasn't just personal preference, it was enforced policy. Attendants were trained to maintain physical distance. Courtiers were expected to bow, not approach. And the royal physicians? They had the hardest job of all. How do you diagnose a king who won't let you examine him? The answer? You didn't. Not properly, anyway. James's medical consultations were often held from across the room. He would describe his symptoms, sometimes at great length and with colorful metaphors, but he flatly refused any physical checkups that required more than visual observation. No pulse checks, no prodding, no temperature readings. One physician wrote in frustration that His Majesty suffers to describe his humors most eloquently, but forbids all manner of confirming touch. That's a very 17th century way of saying, he talks a lot, but won't let us do anything about it. Instead, James would self-prescribe remedies or consult astrological charts to determine his health. He believed certain alignments of stars could cause illness or imbalance in the body. And if the cosmos said he was fine, then he was. End of discussion. He also dabbled in apothecary work himself. His private chambers were reportedly stocked with vials of herbal mixtures, oils, salts, and powders, most of which he administered without any external help. He trusted his own instincts more than any medical authority, especially if that authority tried to come near him with a thermometer, or, more accurately for the time, a heated hand and a concerned look. This aversion to touch extended even into his social life. While James had favorites at court, most notably George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, he rarely embraced them physically. Affection was expressed in letters, in gifts, in dramatic verbal declarations, but not in hugs. James could write with soul and passion. He could command a room with rhetoric. But physical intimacy? Off limits. Interestingly, this strange boundary coexisted with his love of animals, especially his beloved dogs. They were allowed to approach him, sleep near him, and even accompany him during formal events. One ambassador wrote with confusion, "His Majesty recoils from man's hand but invites the company of hounds." Which, to be fair, sounds like something a lot of people can relate to. James's aversion wasn't rooted in cruelty. He wasn't cold. He was simply uncomfortable. The body, his own and others, was a source of anxiety, not pride. And for a king who ruled through intellect and symbolism, who wrote treatises and sermons and authorized the King James Bible, the idea of being physically vulnerable was intolerable. He could argue, he could decree, but he could not, and would not, be prodded. So the next time you read about the divine right of kings, imagine James sitting on a throne built for ceremony, robes draped just so, speaking for hours, and flinching ever so slightly if anyone stepped too close. And from a monarch who feared the touch of doctors, we now turn to a queen who ran headlong into the opposite extreme, not only embracing discomfort but inviting it, through a daily regimen that involved vinegar, corsets, and a complete disregard for breathable fabric. 18. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II. When most people think of royal fashion, they picture opulence, gold-threaded gowns, jewel-crusted bodices, and fabrics so rare they make silk look modest. But for Queen Caroline of Ansbach, fashion wasn't just about elegance or spectacle. It was about discipline, pain, control, and vinegar. Caroline, the intelligent and politically shrewd wife of King George II, had one particular obsession that baffled even her inner circle. She insisted on being laced into vinegar-soaked corsets every day, not occasionally, not for formal events, every day. Rain or shine, summer or frost, whether she was addressing ambassadors or simply sitting for a portrait, Caroline was cinched in tightly, with acid-dampened linen pressed against her skin like a challenge to comfort itself. Why vinegar? Why a corset that smelled like pickling brine and stung like a cold slap? The answer lies in the royal cocktail of vanity, medicine, and sheer willpower. During the 18th century, vinegar was believed to have health benefits. Physicians claimed it could kill bad airs, tone the flesh, sharpen the mind, and even prevent plague. In some circles, it was thought to reduce inflammation and preserve the skin. It was also rumored to help maintain a slim figure by drying out excess fat, an idea entirely unsupported by science but stubbornly persistent among the fashionable elite. For Queen Caroline, vinegar was part of her daily regimen. Her maids soaked her undergarments and corset linings in vinegar, then dried them just enough to avoid full saturation. The result was a slightly damp, acrid-smelling inner layer that clung to her like a second skin. Then came the lacing. Her corsets were legendary, tight to the point of compression, stitched with steel-boned reinforcements, and tugged daily until her waist was practically re-engineered. The vinegar was believed to help keep the skin firm and pale, while the corset kept the body in order, as one courtier put it. Together they formed a kind of wearable chastity, a fortress of discomfort that she wore like armor, and she wore it proudly. Caroline was not a passive royal consort. She was known for her intellect, her influence over state matters, and her ability to hold her own in political debate. She hosted salons, advised ministers, and corresponded with philosophers. She was modern in thought, but rigid in habit. While she supported science, she also adhered to rituals that would make a modern dermatologist weep. She trusted vinegar more than vanity, and corsets more than comfort. Servants whispered about her dedication. There were days when she was clearly in pain, her breathing shallow, her movement restricted, but she refused to loosen the laces. When questioned, she simply replied that it was a queen's duty to appear tight-laced in both figure and judgment. Even in her final years, when her health began to decline, Caroline continued the practice. We now know she suffered from a hernia and multiple internal complications, but she never loosened the regime. To her, relaxing the corset would have meant relaxing her standards, an indulgence she could not allow. Not as a woman, not as a queen. She passed on her vinegar wisdom to ladies of the court, who adopted the habit with varying degrees of success and considerably less commitment. It became, briefly, a micro-trend in high society. But no one matched Caroline's intensity. Most abandoned the practice after a week or two. Only the queen kept it going for years, long enough for her to become legend, not just for her mind, but for her ironclad middle and pickled poise. If Queen Victoria ruled with black crepe and mourning jewelry, Queen Caroline ruled with acid and iron lacing. So the next time you hear the phrase tight-laced, remember it wasn't always a metaphor. And now, from vinegar-drenched corsets to something equally unsettling but far more sentimental, we arrive at a king whose obsession wasn't with fashion or figure, but with hair. Not his own, not always from the living, and never quite collected with permission. 19. King George III. When people think of King George III, they often remember two things. He lost America, and he lost his mind. But what's rarely discussed, and perhaps even stranger than either of those, is his quiet, compulsive obsession with hair. Not wigs, not styling, collecting. George III had a habit that, over time, turned from odd to deeply unsettling. He clipped, hoarded, cataloged, and even preserved locks of hair from people around him, servants, family members, friends, and, on occasion, strangers. He kept them neatly labeled in envelopes, tied with ribbons, or pressed in small books. Some were tucked inside letters, others were stored in glass lockets, and a few, according to whispered accounts from the palace, were simply folded into his jacket pocket and forgotten until the next laundry day. Hair, in the 18th century, was already a meaningful token. Lovers exchanged locks, mourning families preserved curls, and royal children often had their hair snipped for keepsakes. But George took the practice far beyond custom. For him, it became a personal archive of the people in his life, a tactile memory bank. When he loved someone, he took a lock of hair. When he forgave someone, he took a lock of hair. When he felt uncertain about someone, well, he still took a lock of hair. Sometimes he asked permission. Sometimes he didn't. At first it seemed sweet, if a little old-fashioned. He began with locks from his children, of which he had 15, and from Queen Charlotte, to whom he was deeply devoted. But as time went on, the collecting escalated. Palace attendants reported that he would linger near a person's head during conversation, eyeing their curls with more interest than their words. Servants learned to keep their hair pinned up or covered, especially when alone with him. Courtiers joked, nervously, that one should never turn their back on the king if they had a good head of hair. He would sometimes take scissors himself. One valet claimed that George asked him to lean forward for a closer look at his powdered wig, then swiftly snipped a piece of his actual hair without warning. The king then walked away, humming contentedly, leaving the servant holding his breath and his dignity together. These locks weren't hidden either. George stored them in elaborate boxes, some with tiny drawers and personalized labels. A few were organized by emotion, fondness, regret, trust, as though he were creating a library of the people in his life, arranged by his changing feelings toward them. He reportedly reread the names, touched the strands, and reflected on past conversations as if they lived again through the fibers. Some historians interpret this as a symptom of his mental instability, an early marker of the episodes that would later define his legacy. Others see it as a poignant, if peculiar, coping mechanism. George was a man under immense pressure, politically embattled, emotionally repressed, and burdened with the task of holding a sprawling empire together while his own health unraveled. In that context, the hair became a way to preserve the people he couldn't always hold on to. The symbolism is hard to ignore. Hair, after all, is one of the last things to decay, a relic of the living even after death. For George, it may have offered a sense of permanence in a world slipping constantly out of control. And when his mind eventually did begin to fray, when he started talking to trees and mistaking the furniture for foreign dignitaries, his habit only intensified. One report from his later years describes him cradling a ribbon-tied bundle of curls and weeping quietly, murmuring the name of a long-dead daughter. In a reign marked by loss, of colonies, of public favor, and of mental clarity, these strands of hair became a private rebellion against impermanence. A way to hold something still. And speaking of royals clinging to things long past their due, let's now turn to a princess whose legacy wasn't political at all, but smoky, smoldering, and permanently burned into the upholstery. 20. Princess Margaret. If Buckingham Palace had a scent in the mid-20th century, it wasn't fresh flowers, old wood, or polished silver. It was cigarette smoke, thick, perfumed, relentless, and it was coming from Princess Margaret. The younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, Margaret was many things: elegant, rebellious, chronically bored, and devastatingly quick with a dry put-down. But more than anything, she was a chain smoker with a furniture-destroying habit that outlived most of her relationships. Her cigarettes weren't just a personal vice. They were part of her persona, aesthetic, aura, a slow-burning rebellion that left actual burn marks wherever she went. From her earliest years as a public figure, Margaret smoked with the casual defiance of someone who knew the rules but chose not to care. She began smoking as a teenager, well before it was socially accepted for young royal women, and simply never stopped. By the time she was in her 30s, she was reportedly consuming up to 60 cigarettes a day, a number that's hard to process until you realize she had a routine that made it possible. Wake up, smoke, dress, smoke, breakfast, smoke, public appearance, smoke in the car, gala event, smoke between courses. It was less a habit and more a carefully choreographed performance. But what made Margaret's smoking habit truly unusual wasn't the quantity. It was the total disregard for where she did it. She smoked everywhere. Everywhere. Drawing rooms, bedrooms, palace corridors, private jets, royal cars, friends' sofas, and, infamously, right into the upholstery. Servants eventually stopped trying to clean the burn marks. Her furniture was a catalog of scorched velvet, blistered leather, and gently charred lace. Ashtrays were optional. Margaret often used whatever was nearby: plates, flower pots, crystal vases. At one dinner, she allegedly stubbed out a cigarette on a priceless antique plate with a shrug and said, "They've had worse." Her smoking wasn't discreet. There was no effort to hide it behind fans or retreat to secluded terraces. She blew smoke rings during interviews, flicked ash near priceless tapestries, lit up during meetings with dignitaries. When told to extinguish her cigarette in a non-smoking hotel in the U.S., she replied, "I'm royal, not subject." The palace tried, gently and then desperately, to curb her behavior. Ashtrays were placed strategically. Furniture was reupholstered with fire-resistant fabrics. One aide suggested an air purification system be installed in Kensington Palace solely to manage her cloud. Nothing worked. Margaret smoked through every royal protocol, every design intervention, every health scare. Her smoking was more than just an addiction. It was her rebellion against royal stiffness, against her lack of constitutional purpose, and maybe even against her sister's steady hand on the throne. While Elizabeth represented order, Margaret smoldered with chaos. She was the spark in the corner of the room, the scandal you couldn't look away from, the burn on the armrest that told you she had been here. Ironically, she was meticulous in other ways. Her appearance was carefully curated. Her makeup routine was legendary. Her hair was set with military precision, but the cigarettes, those were her constant. She didn't care if they stained her fingers or cracked her voice. In a world that tried to contain her, they were hers. Friends say she never acknowledged the damage, either to her health or her surroundings. She smoked at weddings, funerals, hospital visits, and on yachts. Even when she was ill, even when advised to stop, she simply adjusted her technique. Lighter cigarettes, a longer holder, a more forgiving chair. By the end of her life, her residences bore the evidence of her lifelong commitment. Burn marks on silk, ash in the drapes, yellowed ceilings, and that unmistakable smell that lingered long after she was gone. Princess Margaret didn't just leave a mark on history, she literally scorched it into the furniture. And from a woman who treated smoke as wallpaper, let's now shift to a queen who treated astrology as her personal cabinet, consulting the stars not for poetry or philosophy, but for serious statecraft. Because why ask Parliament when you can ask the planets? 21. Queen Elizabeth I. If you thought Queen Elizabeth I ruled solely with strategy, steel, and sheer political brilliance, you'd be right. But you'd also be missing one of her more peculiar habits. She didn't make a major decision without consulting the stars. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana of England's golden age, was a woman so deeply practical and politically sharp that she outwitted popes, kings, and half her own court. And yet, behind her meticulous public image, she maintained a deeply private devotion to a habit many of her advisors found more than a little strange: astrology. Not for fun, not for parlor games, but for governance. Elizabeth employed official court astrologers, and not just in a ceremonial capacity. Chief among them was John Dee, a polymath, astronomer, mathematician, and self-styled angelic communicator who served as her personal advisor on all matters celestial. Dee didn't just cast horoscopes for entertainment. He was tasked with plotting coronations, interpreting omens, selecting favorable dates for speeches, treaties, and even battles. And the Queen took his advice seriously. Before launching a royal decree, before embarking on a royal tour, and especially before engaging with foreign powers, Elizabeth reportedly asked Dee to read the heavens. He would consult his ephemerides, map out planetary alignments, and determine the most auspicious time to act. Only then would the wheels of power begin to turn. To her inner circle, this was baffling. Elizabeth was famously hard-nosed in policy and ruthless when necessary. But when it came to timing, she wanted Saturn in the right house, Mercury behaving itself, and Mars nowhere near retrograde. She wasn't naive. Elizabeth didn't believe that the stars controlled her fate, but she did believe that they whispered clues to those clever enough to listen. She once referred to astrology as the wisdom of the skies, and when questioned on her reliance on it, she reportedly replied, "God placed signs above us so we may not stumble blindly below." Of course, this habit had limits. She wasn't delaying battles just because a comet passed overhead, though she once postponed diplomatic negotiations because the moon was in Scorpio. Her advisors learned to tread carefully. A poorly timed suggestion could be overridden by a bad celestial alignment. You could present the perfect argument, but if Jupiter wasn't in harmony with Venus, you were wasting your breath. Foreign diplomats took note of her astrological leanings. Some even tried to weaponize them. There's record of Spanish envoys attempting to influence English court astrologers or circulate rumors of omens to create hesitation in Elizabeth's court. None of it worked. She trusted D, and D only. Her fascination wasn't limited to politics. She reportedly had personal horoscopes drawn for several suitors. One such reading supposedly predicted that a marriage with a particular foreign prince would bring cold grief under a false spring. She declined the proposal. Whether it was the stars or the man's haircut is unclear, but Elizabeth never married. And some say her natal chart had more to do with that than any counselor's advice. Even her public image was tinged with celestial symbolism. Her gowns were embroidered with stars, suns, and crescent moons. Portraits often show her holding orbs, standing atop globes, or framed by halos of golden light. Not purely artistic choices, but nods to her cultivated image as a monarch of cosmic significance. Elizabeth didn't just read the stars, she positioned herself as one, fixed, guiding, unreachable. In the end, this strange habit only deepened her mystique. Was she the iron-fisted ruler of Protestant England? Yes. Was she also someone who wouldn't dare sign a treaty unless Mercury was in a good mood? Also yes. And so we move now from the queen who read the stars to a king who let the stars decide when to kill. Because if Elizabeth asked the heavens for timing, her father, Henry VIII, asked them for permission. 22. King Henry VIII. If Queen Elizabeth I turned to the stars for counsel, her father, King Henry VIII, turned to them for permission, particularly when it came to war, betrayal, and the occasional execution. For a man remembered for brute force, 6 marriages, and a trail of discarded alliances, it's oddly fitting that behind all the swagger was a deeply superstitious man who refused to move troops or a pen without consulting his astrologers first. Yes, Henry VIII, the larger-than-life monarch who broke England from Rome and founded the Church of England, also spent a surprising amount of time asking the sky if now was a good time to do something dramatic. Astrology in Henry's court wasn't a fringe fascination. It was statecraft. His reign, especially in its early years, was flooded with horoscopes, planetary tables, and calculations performed by court-appointed astrologers who operated under strict secrecy and often with nervous hands. These men weren't offering vague cosmic poetry, they were expected to deliver answers. Before Henry made military decisions, like when to send troops to France or when to engage in skirmishes with the Scots, he would demand astrological readings. Alignments of Mars war, Saturn discipline, and Jupiter victory were studied. If the planets didn't line up in his favor, he waited, sometimes for weeks. Armies on standby, ships in harbor, generals pacing, wondering why they weren't moving, when really it was because Saturn was having a bad day. This wasn't just about military campaigns. Henry consulted the stars for personal matters too. Several of his marriages, especially the early ones, were preceded by astrological vetting. Charts were drawn to determine compatibility, predict outcomes, and assess whether heirs would follow. When Anne Boleyn first entered his orbit, it's believed that Henry requested her natal chart. Whether he ignored its warnings or interpreted them too generously, well, we all know how that story ended. When Anne's fortunes turned, astrologers again played a role. Henry reportedly asked for celestial readings during the period leading up to her arrest and eventual execution. Did he really need the stars to justify what was already politically convenient? Maybe not. But for a king who thought of himself as divinely appointed, a cosmic nod never hurt. His astrologers walked a dangerous line. Give good news, and you were rewarded. Give bad news, especially if it contradicted the king's desires, and you risked being imprisoned or worse. One astrologer, Thomas Hilly, allegedly fled court after a series of predictions failed to materialize. Another, William Perrin, disappeared from records entirely after making a bold and incorrect prophecy about a male heir. Henry also had an in-house alchemist, John Damien, who dabbled in both astrology and attempts to turn base metals into gold. Damien famously tried to prove his loyalty to the stars by constructing wings and jumping off the roof of Stirling Castle. He survived, barely. His dignity did not. Henry, however, was reportedly amused, and still kept him around. At times, his dependence on astrology bordered on the comedic. When England experienced a series of bad harvests, Henry blamed malefic conjunctions and demanded his astrologers write against the sky. It's unclear what that meant. Possibly prayers, possibly threatening letters to Mars. But under the humor was a serious belief. Henry saw himself as part of a cosmic order. A king among men, yes, but also a player in a divine theater where the stars whispered truths, warnings, and ideally endorsements of his next impulsive move. He may have ruled with force, but Henry never acted alone. At least not in his mind. The heavens were always consulted, and when they aligned, God help whoever was on the wrong side of them. And speaking of royalty who kept one foot in this world and the other halfway to the grave, let's turn now to a queen who kept her death shrouds on standby at all times. Because you never know when the end might come, and style apparently doesn't stop at the coffin. 23. Mary, Queen of Scots. Some monarchs prepare for war. Others prepare for coronations. Mary, Queen of Scots, prepared for her own funeral, repeatedly, obsessively, almost artistically. While most royals of her era carefully avoided the topic of death, at least publicly, Mary embraced it like an old friend who might drop by unannounced. Her strange, unwavering habit? She kept custom-made death shrouds ready at all times. Not just one, several. Stitched, perfumed, folded, and stored within reach, she had her burial clothes laid out long before anyone had sharpened the axe. And no, this wasn't a ceremonial tradition. It was personal. Mary designed them herself, chose the fabrics, directed the embroidery, selected the colors, white, traditionally associated with mourning in France, where she was once queen. The shrouds weren't generic funeral garb, they were tailored gowns of mortality, and her attendants were expected to maintain them with the same reverence they gave to her coronation robes or royal jewels. From her time as a young widow in France to her long years of captivity in England, Mary carried the weight of death with her everywhere. And not in an abstract, poetic sense. She expected it. She planned for it. She rehearsed it. Why? Perhaps because death had always shadowed her life. She became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old. By 18, she was a widow. By her mid-20s, she had survived rebellions, imprisonment, accusations of murder, and a forced abdication. She was exiled from her homeland, separated from her son, and kept under near-constant surveillance by her cousin, Elizabeth I. At every stage, someone wanted her dead, and she knew it. In a letter from captivity, Mary once wrote, "Let my enemies find me dressed as I lived, prepared." That wasn't melodrama. That was strategy. The presence of her shrouds became part of daily life in her household. Servants dusted them. Ladies-in-waiting aired them. One maid recounted how Mary would occasionally examine the folds, checking for decay or damage, murmuring prayers as she did. And then, just as calmly, she would order them refolded and returned to their cabinet, beside her prayer books and letters. This morbid readiness unsettled many who served her. Some begged her to stop. Others tried to hide the garments. But Mary insisted. She claimed it was a queen's duty to meet fate not only with grace, but with intention. And when rumors of her impending execution intensified, she added more details. Which jewelry should accompany her? Which prayer should be spoken? Which fabric should line the casket? In a strange way, the shrouds became her power. If she couldn't control her freedom, or her legacy, or the army scheming against her, then at least she could control her ending. Even in captivity, she crafted the final image the world would see. Not as a prisoner, not as a victim. As a queen, dressed for the end with absolute clarity. And when that day finally arrived, after 19 years in English custody, Mary wore red, the color of Catholic martyrdom, instead of her usual white. Her execution was brutal, but her composure was unshakable. She arranged her hair. She brought her own crucifix. And according to several witnesses, she reminded her attendants not to forget the shroud. It's tempting to read this as performative. But for Mary, it wasn't a performance. It was a long-awaited cue. And from a queen who dressed for death daily, we now cross into the life of a boy king who surrounded himself not with courtiers or generals, but with charms, talismans, and whispered protections against betrayal. Because when you're crowned too young to understand politics, you put your trust in magic instead. 24. King Edward VI. Most kings inherit advisors, armies, and enemies. Edward VI inherited all of the above, plus the full weight of a collapsing religious order, a dying father's unfinished legacy, and a crown that sat too heavily on a 12-year-old head. So it's no wonder that in the absence of experience, what the young king reached for was magic. Or, at the very least, its early modern equivalent. Talismans, protective charms, and an entire chamber filled with so-called spiritual safeguards. From the outside, Edward VI's reign looked like a textbook case of regency rule. Too young to govern, he was flanked by powerful men, first his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who used the king's name to pass laws and manipulate power. But beneath the politics, in the quiet halls of his personal chambers, Edward created a space all his own. A place where the rational met the irrational, and where a boy surrounded by danger tried to find safety in rituals, relics, and whispered superstition. Reports from his inner household suggest that Edward's private rooms were filled with objects intended to protect him from betrayal, sickness, and the supernatural. Silver amulets were stitched into the hems of his garments. Iron charms, said to ward off malevolent spirits, were hidden under his mattress. He wore a small leather pouch around his neck, containing herbs and inscriptions believed to shield him from poison, envy, and sudden death. These weren't the whimsical superstitions of a child. They were organized, cataloged, systematic. Edward had entire cabinets dedicated to different types of talismans, categorized by purpose: protection against lies, protection against fever, protection against heartbreak. He had engraved coins, lucky animal bones, crystals soaked in moonlight, and miniature scrolls of scripture sealed in beeswax. Some were gifts from well-meaning courtiers. Others were likely acquired in secret, passed along by servants or traveling mystics who knew how to exploit fear in royal households. Even more intriguing was his fascination with angelic symbols. Influenced perhaps by the rising popularity of mystic scholars like John Dee, who would later advise his sister Elizabeth I, Edward allegedly kept angelic sigils in his private prayer book. These weren't traditional Christian icons, but strange geometric shapes said to offer divine protection. He would trace them with his fingers before bed. Some nights, he asked for them to be drawn in chalk beneath his windowsill. The paradox is striking. Edward VI, The boy king, raised on Protestant rationalism, overseen by a court obsessed with purging superstition and Catholic ritual, spent his private hours surrounded by objects that had far more in common with medieval folk magic than Reformation theology. In public, he was the young reformer. In private, he was afraid. And why wouldn't he be? He watched those around him fall, uncle after uncle, advisor after advisor, friend after friend, brought down by treason, disease, or the casual cruelty of Tudor politics. He was told he was the head of the Church of England, and yet he was powerless to choose his own bedtimes. He was the most powerful child in England, and simultaneously its most fragile. When his health began to fail in 1552, those around him doubled down on prayer. Edward, meanwhile, returned to his charms. New ones were added: red coral beads, believed to protect against fevers, a rabbit's foot, oddly modern in its appearance, and a hand-drawn symbol he had created himself, scribbled in the margins of his diary, shaped like a star but marked with small crosses. No one knows exactly what it meant. Perhaps not even Edward. He died the next year, barely 15. His court blamed illness, betrayal, perhaps divine punishment. But in his chambers, they found something else. Drawers of talismans, forgotten pouches, and a diary filled with strange symbols and prayers. It wasn't madness. It was fear. And a deep, lonely attempt to survive a world where even kings could disappear overnight. And from one ruler who sought protection in superstition, we now visit a monarch whose nightly ritual involved lighting bonfires, not for warmth or beauty, but to ward off witches, because the real threat, he believed, didn't come from armies or assassination plots, but from the shadows. 25. King James I. For most monarchs, nighttime was a time to rest, when the palace went quiet, the fire dimmed, and the guards took up their posts while the sovereign slipped into slumber. But for King James I, the night was never just darkness. It was a battlefield, and he fought it not with swords, nor even prayer, but with the thing he believed would keep him safe from his greatest fear: bonfires. Yes, bonfires. Lit nightly, strategically placed, sometimes inside the palace walls, other times just outside, depending on which astrologer or court advisor had most recently whispered a warning into the king's already anxious ear. Because James I, great unifier of the crowns, patron of the arts, and translator of the most famous English Bible in history, was absolutely, unshakably terrified of witches. And he wasn't subtle about it. By the time he took the English throne in 1603, James had already authored Demonology, a full-blown theological and political treatise on the existence and dangers of witchcraft. In it, he insisted that witches were not only real, but actively conspiring to destroy Christian monarchs, and most likely him in particular. He cited storms conjured by magic, illnesses delivered through cursed objects, and dreams that, he claimed, were dark omens masked as mere visions. He believed witches could fly, speak with spirits, and steal men's lives with a single glance. So, every night, his court became a stage for precaution. And the most dramatic prop of all? Fire. It began in Scotland during his early years as king there, when a violent storm nearly capsized the ship carrying James and his bride, Anne of Denmark, back from Norway. James was convinced it wasn't just bad weather. It was a magical attack orchestrated by witches. Several women in North Berwick were arrested and accused of casting spells to sink the royal vessel. Their confessions, wrung under torture, fueled James's paranoia. From then on, fire became his symbolic shield. Once he was in England, the nightly bonfires began. They weren't enormous, but they were consistent. Torches, hearths, controlled burns in iron basins. Some were placed at palace entrances, others near the king's chambers. In one documented case, a small fire was kept burning in a hallway all night long to warm the air and ward off enchantment. a courtier wrote. Servants were given strict instructions to keep flames lit, especially during witching hours near midnight. And James didn't just rely on open flame. He carried protective charms, avoided certain woods, refused to sleep in rooms with exposed beams, which he believed gave witches a place to perch. His bed linens were occasionally doused with herbal infusions, and a personal guard was assigned the quiet task of checking for hex marks, symbols scratched into doors, furniture, or mirrors. All of this stemmed from a singular belief, that as a king he was a target, not just politically but cosmically. He saw himself as a divine ruler, and therefore the enemy of all that was dark and unnatural. And while his obsession with witches might sound like a medieval holdover, it was very much part of the modern politics of his time. Witch trials were ramping up across Europe. The English public feared sorcery. James wasn't out of step. He was, in many ways, leading the charge. His fear also served a political purpose. By identifying an enemy that was unseen, unknowable, and everywhere, he consolidated his own power as a man of divine insight. Only he could interpret the signs. Only he could name the threat. And only he knew that fire was the answer. Ironically, this man who feared being watched by spirits ruled over a court that was constantly watching him, taking mental notes as their monarch ordered another brazier filled and another witch-hunting pamphlet printed. And from a king who feared spectral threats so much he lit the night ablaze, we now turn to one who kept the memory of the executed close, not metaphorically but physically. Because when your friends are gone, what better way to keep them near than as sacred relics, tucked away for prayer? 26. King Charles I. Some monarchs build monuments to their fallen allies. Some commission paintings. Some name buildings or ships in their honor. King Charles I, he kept their mementos. And not just in his mind or in a diary, but quite literally. He preserved personal items belonging to his executed friends and treated them like sacred relics. Welcome to one of the most quietly unnerving habits in royal history. Charles I kept objects that had belonged to men who were publicly beheaded, sometimes by his own regime, sometimes by political enemies, and he would pray to them, as if these were not simply artifacts, but saints' remains. To understand the full weight of this, you have to understand Charles himself, a man defined by his contradictions. He was refined, deeply religious, politically rigid, and almost pathologically loyal to certain people. He was a king who believed in absolute monarchy, but also absolute martyrdom. And so, when those closest to him fell to the axe, he did not cast them out of memory. He elevated them. Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, was one of the first. Strafford had been Charles's most trusted advisor, a man he defended publicly, even as the Parliament demanded his execution. Under pressure, Charles reluctantly signed his death warrant, an act that tormented him for the rest of his life. According to court accounts, Charles kept several of Strafford's personal effects, letters, a ring, and even his gloves. These items were not stored in some dusty drawer. They were kept close, sometimes on his desk, sometimes in his coat. And during private prayer, Charles would reportedly lay them before him and weep. Another example, William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, another close ally executed during the turbulence of the English Civil War. After Laud's death, Charles requested some of his belongings be returned to the royal household. He preserved Laud's annotated Bible and reportedly had a small ivory cross made from wood found near the site of Laud's imprisonment. Again, these were not political tokens. They were objects of personal veneration. Some historians have dismissed this behavior as simple grief. Others interpret it as political theater. But those who knew Charles, especially those who served him during his imprisonment, described it differently. They said he spoke to these relics, not as mad hallucinations or elaborate rituals, but as part of his daily devotions. He would refer to the dead as the faithful, and their items as witnesses to the truth. In Charles's mind, these were not just fallen men, They were martyrs. And in a strange twist of fate, he too would eventually become one. After his trial and execution in 1649, his supporters referred to him as King Charles the Martyr. A church was named after him. His image appeared in prayer books. The same king who once prayed to the relics of the dead became one himself, enshrined, remembered, almost canonized. There's a tragic symmetry in that. Charles, who saw death as divine proof of loyalty, who kept the memory of the executed alive through physical relics and whispered prayers, would become another relic in the end. His downfall, his silence at the scaffold, even the white shirt he wore to prevent his shivering from being seen, all carefully constructed acts of martyrdom, fitting for a man who had long turned politics into a form of faith. So while other kings feared being forgotten, Charles feared forgetting. And so he surrounded himself with the fragments of loyalty lost, a personal cathedral of absence, built from gloves, letters, and memories too painful to let go. And now, from a monarch who turned the dead into saints, we move to one who feared death so much he developed an entirely bizarre ritual to delay it. A man so superstitious he refused to fall asleep fully undressed, because in his mind, death couldn't reach you if you still had one boot on. 27. King George IV. There are kings who feared death, and then there was King George IV, who fought it off each night the only way he knew how, by keeping one boot on while he slept. Not two, not none, just one, preferably the left. The logic? If death came for him in his sleep, it wouldn't dare claim a man who wasn't fully undressed. It sounds absurd, and it was. But for George, it made perfect sense. This peculiar ritual wasn't a passing eccentricity. It was an ironclad habit enforced nightly with the seriousness of a military drill. Every evening his valet would assist in removing his elaborate wardrobe piece by piece. Jacket, cravat, waistcoat, one boot, the other. No, not the other. That one stayed. The boot remained on, tightly fastened, resting against fine silk sheets, a lone piece of leathered defiance against mortality. Some courtiers believed it was superstition. Others chalked it up to vanity. But George insisted that sleeping with one boot on would confuse death, as if the Grim Reaper arrived only for those fully at rest, properly laid out, decent and symmetrical. If he kept one boot on, George reasoned, he was not technically asleep, and thus not technically available for collection. He wasn't joking. Night after night he would lie in bed, bloated from his usual 12-course meal, wearing an embroidered dressing gown on top, and a riding boot below. It became part of palace routine. Servants whispered about it in the halls. Visitors sometimes caught glimpses of it through half-open doors and had to pretend it wasn't the strangest thing they'd ever seen. Foreign dignitaries were warned not to ask. One French ambassador who did so was met with a curt, "His Majesty is at perpetual readiness," which clarified nothing. But like many of George IV's quirks, this one was inseparable from the rest of his complicated persona. By the time he ascended the throne, George was already a man in physical decline. Years of indulgence, rich food, drink, excess of every kind, had taken their toll. He suffered from chronic pain, insomnia, and increasing paranoia. His body was betraying him, and he knew it. The boot, then, became more than superstition. It was ritualized denial, a nightly refusal to surrender. As long as the boot stayed on, so did he. This wasn't his only attempt at holding off the inevitable. George surrounded himself with life-lengthening potions, tonics, and physicians, some reputable, others less so. He once paid a fortune for a French elixir said to rejuvenate the royal humors, which was essentially flavored brandy. He ordered his bedstead redesigned with hidden compartments for medicine, and had special breathing pillows crafted to ward off nightmares. But nothing matched the symbolic power of that single boot. And make no mistake, it had to be a riding boot. Not a slipper, not a house shoe. He believed that if he were called upon to defend his throne or face death, he should be partially dressed for battle. There's something comically tragic about that image. A man so consumed by fears of irrelevance and decay that he armored himself with half an outfit. The irony? George was a king who avoided war, dodged confrontation, and preferred luxurious dinners to duels. The riding boot wasn't preparation. It was posturing. But to him, it mattered. When he eventually passed away in 1830, his attendants found the boot beside his bed, neatly placed, its leather creased from years of dutiful wear, not from riding, but from resisting. It was, by then, less a garment and more a monument, a final joke, a relic of a monarch who hoped he could outwit death by simply never being fully asleep. And now, from one royal who fought off mortality with half a wardrobe, we meet a queen who chose to live as if death had never happened at all, laying out her husband's clothes every morning for decades after his passing, as though he were just running late. 28. Queen Victoria. Grief is a heavy thing. For most people it fades. For Queen Victoria, it simply put on a fresh waistcoat every morning and waited quietly in the next room. Because after Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria didn't mourn him for a few months, or a year, or even a decade. She mourned him for the rest of her life, and not just in spirit. She did it logistically. Every morning for the next 40 years, the Queen had Prince Albert's clothes laid out as if he were still alive and preparing for another day of royal duties. His boots were polished. His shaving water was drawn. His dressing gown was pressed and placed exactly where it would have been had he still been occupying his side of their bedroom. This was not a symbolic act carried out once or twice for show. It became a daily ritual, baked into the palace schedule. Servants, under strict orders, maintained Albert's chambers exactly as they had been during his lifetime. Nothing was moved without permission. His pen and blotting pad remained on the writing desk. Fresh towels were placed in the washroom. Even the pillows were fluffed. It would be easy to assume this was some early Victorian version of romantic theater, a dramatic, sentimental gesture by a queen overwhelmed with grief. But that doesn't quite capture the scale or the consistency. Victoria institutionalized her mourning. She wore black for the remainder of her reign. She refused to allow court life to return to its full social rhythms. For years, balls were canceled, banquets pared down, and music softened to a whisper. The Queen had become a monument, draped in jet beads and black silk. Yet it was the everydayness of her rituals that made them so surreal. Visitors to the royal residences would sometimes pass by Prince Albert's room and see his personal belongings perfectly arranged, untouched, and yet constantly maintained. Meals were occasionally brought in and then taken away untouched, as if he simply wasn't hungry that day. One chambermaid noted that dusting around Albert's books was like dusting around a ghost. And this devotion wasn't confined to one location. When Victoria traveled between her residences, Balmoral, Windsor, Osborne, Albert's things would precede her, carefully unpacked and arranged by the time she arrived. In each home, a part of him had been preserved, like a royal echo stretched thin across geography. Why did she do it? Some biographers suggest that Albert had been the only person in her life with whom she had shared true intellectual and emotional intimacy. His loss left her not only bereft but directionless. Victoria had been raised in emotional confinement, surrounded by political manipulation and stifled affection. Albert had been her anchor. His death didn't just remove a husband, it unraveled her sense of safety. But rather than let go, she did something profoundly human. She kept pretending, not in madness but in order. By maintaining his routines, she maintained her own. In a world that had suddenly become untrustworthy, Albert's coat on the chair was something she could still control. This ritual transformed her grief into legacy. Entire generations of royal children grew up in palaces where the dead were not buried, but accommodated. Victoria made mourning fashionable, institutional, and curiously domestic. She didn't just carry loss, she curated it. And speaking of monarchs with unusual conversations, we now arrive at a king who, when his mind unraveled, began speaking not to people, but to trees. Trees he believed were foreign kings, diplomats, and maybe even better company than Parliament ever was. 29. King George III. Long before history painted him as the mad king who lost America, King George III was already holding conversations with foreign leaders. The only twist? Those leaders were trees. Not metaphors for people, not code names. Actual trees. Bark, leaves, branches, and, in the king's unraveling mind, crowns. It's a moment of royal eccentricity that teeters on the edge of tragedy and absurdity. But as with most peculiar royal behaviors, there's a strange kind of logic to it. One rooted in George's relentless sense of duty, his slipping grip on reality, and his need to make order from the chaos brewing inside his own mind. By the early 1800s, George III's mental health was deteriorating rapidly. The exact cause is still debated: porphyria, bipolar disorder, or a combination of psychological and physical conditions. But what's certain is that the man who had once been the embodiment of royal decorum began seeing the world very differently. And when his mind drifted, he didn't lose his sense of kingship. He just reassigned the titles to oaks, elms, and sycamores. Multiple records from Windsor and Kew Gardens tell us that George would walk through the royal grounds for hours, speaking in full courtly tones to individual trees. He would bow, wait for responses, and deliver entire diplomatic monologues. One moment he'd address a weeping willow as the King of Prussia. The next, he'd reprimand a stubborn chestnut for failing to uphold an imaginary treaty. Servants watched, horrified and bewildered. Some wept. Others just let him speak. What's remarkable is how detailed the conversations were. George didn't babble. He made sense, just not here. He spoke in policy terms, discussed matters of foreign diplomacy, and referenced real historical events. He'd recall treaties and alliances, express concern over war debts, and even deliver polite greetings on behalf of Queen Beech, a nickname he gave to one of the taller trees on the southern lawn. To some observers, it was delusion. To others, it was the mind of a monarch trying to hold on to power in the only way he still could, through simulation. Trees, after all, can't argue. They don't betray. They don't draft declarations of independence. In his more lucid moments, George reportedly showed flashes of awareness, shame, even. But during his worst episodes, the trees were his allies, his audience, and his adversaries. The entire political theater of Europe transplanted into the royal gardens. And as the crown slowly slipped from his control, these arboreal councils became the only ones he could command. Which brings us, not far away, to another monarch who also found comfort in silence, but not in trees. Instead, in the absence of speech itself. Because the next king on our list didn't talk to trees. He didn't talk to anyone at all. 30. King Henry VI. If George III ruled through manic monologues and woodland diplomacy, King Henry VI ruled through silence. A silence so deep, so prolonged, and so unnerving that his own court sometimes believed he'd simply ceased to be present at all. Henry VI was not a man of action, nor was he a man of words. In fact, he was often not a man of anything, except stillness. He is perhaps the only English monarch who could sit for days on end, in total silence, staring at a fixed point on the wall, unmoving, unblinking, and unbothered by the world collapsing around him. Historians today would likely diagnose him with catatonic schizophrenia or severe depressive illness. But in the 15th century, it was simply called divine vacancy. Some thought he was touched by God. Others suspected madness. But either way, Henry's silence became a defining feature of his reign. This wasn't garden variety introversion. It was an institutional crisis. Courtiers didn't know whether to proceed with royal matters. Diplomats received no answers. Wars brewed while the king sat, motionless, voiceless, unreachable. At one point, during a particularly extended episode, his wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou, gave birth to their son. Henry reportedly showed no reaction, no joy, no inquiry. He simply stared ahead, as though the birth of an heir had occurred in another dimension. It wasn't until 17 months later that he acknowledged the boy at all. That is not a typo. 17 months. And still, despite these long silences, Henry was kept on the throne, partly because the alternative, open war between rival factions, was worse, and partly because some in the court believed his stillness was a form of saintliness. He was holy, they said, not of this world. And perhaps in some way he wasn't. He preferred monasteries to councils, psalms to policy. He reportedly cried when animals were hurt. He refused to speak ill of anyone, even those trying to depose him. One chronicler noted that his words, when they came, were soft as rain and just as rare. Eventually, his silence would lead to catastrophe. The Wars of the Roses tore through England. Rival kings rose. Henry was deposed, restored, and deposed again, still saying almost nothing. His quiet wasn't just unsettling, it was politically fatal. And yet, among those who knew him best, there was something tragic about that silence. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't foolish. He was simply overwhelmed by a world too loud, too fast, too filled with demands. So he did the only thing he knew. He sat, and he stared, and he said nothing. Which leads us to another royal outlier, one who was anything but still. A king who found comfort not in silence or trees, but in manual labor. Ditches, thatched roofs, honest work, the kind that most royals would order done, and he insisted on doing himself. 31st, King Edward II. Some kings wage wars, some issue proclamations. Edward II? He built haystacks. In a court overflowing with pomp, embroidery, and inherited power, Edward was most content digging ditches, thatching roofs, and performing manual labor with commoners. Not for show, not for politics. Just because he liked it. It baffled everyone. Here was the King of England, son of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, husband to the formidable Isabella of France, wandering into fields and asking peasants if he could borrow a spade. He reportedly preferred the company of plowmen to princes, and was happier swinging a scythe than wielding a scepter. This wasn't a one-time quirk. It was a pattern. Edward took breaks from court to travel incognito among the working class. He'd help harvest wheat, repair barns, mend fishing nets, and sleep in peasant cottages. Some said he found solace in the simplicity. Others suspected he simply didn't like being king. At royal banquets, he was known to speak at length about drainage techniques and the quality of thatching in East Anglia. Foreign dignitaries stared in confusion. His nobles winced. But Edward didn't care. He genuinely admired the working poor and believed manual labor was dignified in a way court politics never could be. Naturally, this made him wildly unpopular with the aristocracy. They wanted a warrior king, not a royal farmhand. His interests were considered eccentric at best, humiliating at worst. And when combined with his controversial friendships, political missteps, and military failures, it gave his enemies all the ammunition they needed. He was eventually deposed by his wife and her lover, a drama worthy of its own soap opera, and replaced by his son. But even in his fall, there's something oddly noble about Edward II. In a world of power games, he just wanted to fix a roof, and from a king who preferred the calluses of labor to the comforts of court, we now arrive at a royal bride who insisted her chambers burn with candlelight, not for romance, but for fear. A fear of darkness so deep she surrounded herself with dozens of flames, even as she slept. 32. Charles VI of France's daughter, Isabeau of Bavaria. Her name was Isabeau of Bavaria, though history often refers to her more vaguely as the French princess who married into England and brought with her not just noble blood, but a deeply peculiar fear that transformed her sleeping quarters into a scene straight out of a cathedral. She refused to sleep in the dark. Ever. And not in the mild, nightlight in the hallway sort of way. Isabeau insisted on being surrounded by dozens of candles, lit, maintained, replaced, burning in a full circle around her bed, night after night. No exceptions. The number varied depending on the room, the mood, and how ominous the stars looked that evening. Sometimes it was 12, sometimes 20. In at least one account, there were over 40 candles flickering as she slept, melting down into misshapen towers of wax, while a drowsy servant stood by with extra tapers, just in case. Her maids complained of smoke, the chamber smelled of hot beeswax and scorched linen, and the heat, especially during summer months, was reportedly nearly suffocating. Still, the candles stayed. Why? Isabeau claimed the darkness was not simply unsettling, it was dangerous. She believed shadows could become inhabited, that in darkness things moved. Not animals, not burglars, things with no name. This wasn't idle superstition. Her father, Charles VI of France, famously suffered from what modern historians believe was severe psychosis. He once believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Growing up in that environment, watching the King of France unravel into delusion and fear, left its mark on young Isabeau. When she married into the English court, she brought her habits with her. And while England was no stranger to superstition, Isabeau's nighttime rituals struck her host as extreme. Each night, before she lay down to sleep, she would inspect the positioning of the candles herself. If even one flame flickered too low or one corner of the room remained dim, she'd demand the entire process start again. Some claimed she recited private prayers, not from a standard Bible, but from a handwritten book of personal invocations, annotated with astrological symbols and lunar phases. And once she slept, if sleep is what you'd call it, she slept stiffly, arms folded or clasped, as if posing for her own tomb effigy. A maid once whispered that the queen never seemed to truly sleep at all, only close her eyes for brief spells, then wake in a sweat, eyes darting to the corners. Eventually, her servants adapted. Her candlelit sleeping chambers became a fixture of court gossip. Foreign envoys were advised not to mention the fire hazard. And the Royal Fire Brigade, which, yes, existed in some rudimentary form, was quietly informed of Her Highness's illumination requirements. But it didn't end with her. Some say her daughters adopted versions of the same ritual. And even after her death, for several weeks, the candles were still lit, as if the fear she'd kindled hadn't left the room. From a queen who feared the night so deeply she burned it away, we move now to a king who had a different sort of obsession with darkness. Not with avoiding it, but with writing against it, condemning it, sniffing it. A monarch who hated tobacco with every inch of his royal pen, and yet still kept it close enough to inhale. 33. James VI, or the First. If contradictions were currency, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, would have bankrupted every treasury in Europe. He was the monarch who wrote a passionate, fiery treatise against tobacco, condemning it as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. And then, he kept it in his own chambers. Let's be clear. A counterblast to tobacco wasn't a casual remark. It was a full, polemical pamphlet published in 1604, in which the king laid waste to the rising popularity of smoking. He called it a custom loathsome to the eye, accused it of corrupting English manners, and even tied it to moral decay. He described the act of inhaling smoke as barbarous and befitting only the savage. And yet, behind the scenes, James kept a small wooden box of tobacco leaves tucked away in his private quarters. Not to smoke, to sniff. He claimed it helped clear his sinuses. Others noted he would sniff the tobacco as he paced, particularly before tense meetings. Some believed he even crushed it into sachets to keep in his robes. Tobacco, in his view, was a curse on society, but a useful stimulant if administered in strictly non-pleasurable doses. It wasn't just a personal contradiction. It was policy-level irony. While James raged against tobacco in print, his government quietly licensed its import and profited handsomely from the trade. Colonial expansion in Virginia, named after Elizabeth I, depended heavily on tobacco crops. And James, ever the pragmatic idealist, allowed the hypocrisy to stand, so long as it lined the crown's coffers. But his hatred for the act of smoking remained genuine. He was repulsed by the image of courtiers puffing away during banquets. He banned it from his presence. A Spanish ambassador once lit a pipe during a private audience and was told to extinguish his barbarity or be extinguished himself. Despite his rhetoric, tobacco became a nervous fixation. When he was anxious, he sniffed. When he was tired, he sniffed. Some said he sniffed so often that his handkerchiefs were permanently stained with brown powder. There were rumors, unverified but persistent, that he even commissioned a perfumer to create a scent that would mask the stink of dried tobacco while still giving him the sensory satisfaction. The contradiction never resolved. Even on his deathbed, it said he kept a sachet of ground tobacco nearby, the king who cursed the pipe but courted the leaf.